She wakes up with no memory, but with a sense that a great destiny awaits her. In a snowy village, amidst werewolves and ancient legends, Lily finds herself drawn into a world of mystery, magic, and challenges. Who is she really, and what role does she have to play in this world? Her quest reveals not only the truth about her, but also a love that cannot be ignored. Once upon a time, there was a small village amongst the forests of northern America. Snow towered alongside stone buildings, the fierce cold clawing at the walls throughout the seasons. It threatened, yowled, and hissed to come inside. Warm fires kept the villagers safe from the cold. They huddled up, many living in small homes regardless of overcrowding. It was simply unsafe to live alone. Food was scarce. They found themselves starving during the winter, clutching their stomachs and feeding what little there was to the children. The men hunted ruthlessly during the day, yet only came back with small game or nothing at all. Amongst these villagers was a young little girl. She clutched onto her windowsill, gazing from inside through the frosted glass. Her long white hair cascaded down her shoulders, indingestat her feet. This little girl was named Selene. Regardless of how little she was, she noticed the pain and suffering of those around her. The little girl's heart was as open as the sea, pulling in others for warmth and soothing them of their pains. She was loved throughout the village for her kindness. Clasping her hands together, the little girl looked up at the full moon in the sky. Since birth, villagers would say she had the moon in her eyes, as if it cooed down at her like a mother. While many wished upon the stars, Selene wished upon the moon. Peering up with hope, she'd wish for her friends to be helped. She wished for a solution to this problem and hoped and trusted the moon could help her. Wishing upon a star, or moon in this matter, is seen as childish. Because hope is seen as childish, Selene was not bothered by this common saying. Her hope spread as far as the moon's light, holding the stars in her blanket of a sky like the people in her village. Suddenly the moon shone as bright as the stars in the sky. Though not through words, she felt it tell her that she needed to go into the forest. Her wish has been granted, and it was waiting in depth for her. Selene pulled on her raggedy winter clothes as quickly as possible and sneaked out of her home. The cold nipped at her frail body, but the warmth of the moon kept her safe. Following the light into the forest, she'd twist and turn, following it closely, before she'd slow down. Ahead was a clearing. The snowy clearing was occupied by a laying, large white wolf. Her brilliant white fur shone like the snow, as soft as a sheep's wool and dancing in the winter breeze. Selene gazed in awe of the wolf regardless of how it dwarfed her. The little girl peered down at the leg of the wolf. A cold metal bear trap was attached to the wolf's thigh, keeping the poor thing there to die. If the villagers found the wolf, they'd surely kill it. The quiet shivering of stems brushing against each other was what awoke her. A breeze passed, delicately drifting its hand along every stem, leaf, and branch. It yearned to touch everything, yet it found some crevices untouchable through every drift it did. She shifted, a shiver itching her skin until she shuddered. Caressing her pale skin, she'd hug it tightly before raising herself. A woman sat amongst a beautiful field of lilies. They were nearly ready to bloom, staring at the ground in anticipation. Her white hair, longer than her height, trailed from where she used to rest and disappeared between the stems of flowers. The woman traced her delicate face, finding herself intact and alive. But why would she check if she was alive? Eyes as white as the moon peered up, noticing it looking down at her from the sky. The distinct shape drawn across its round surface reminded her of a side view of a wolf. Had it always been like that? She doesn't know. When the woman looked back down at the lilies, she smiled. White lilies were her favorite, but she doesn't know why or even how she knew. It felt like she happened upon truths with no explanation. She only wore a plain white dress that reached her mid-thigh. The woman shivered, noting the snow surrounding the area. She was nearly naked in the dead of winter, freezing amongst the beautiful flowers. How is it they've survived this long? The crunching of snow stole her attention, and she turned her head to glance around the field. Just outside, approached an elderly woman. She had long hair that had grayed from age a long time ago and beautiful marbled green eyes looking at her with worry. "Oh, La," she muttered, "dear, are you okay?" She'd ask with a frown, her voice thick with an accent she didn't recognize. The woman didn't know what to do, but she shook her head no with a frown. The elderly woman gestured for her to come, make sure not to crush the lilies. She'd warn, "Come quickly. You're going to get frostbite." Timidly standing up, she'd have to bunch up her hair and delicately step between and around the flowers. The stranger watched with bated breaths, wincing whenever she thought she had stepped on a flower. Somehow, she'd managed to get out without hurting a single one. The cold snow hurt the soles of her feet. The woman whimpered, still holding onto her platinum white hair. The elderly woman ushered her away from the field, shrugging off her coat and putting it on the woman's shoulders. "Quickly, my home is close by." She'd say, "How is it you got in the field? It's low, not a soul can go in." That explains why the woman was terrified of potentially hurting the flowers. The pale woman would be too. The poor things are so delicate. They rushed onto a pathway and through the woods that surrounded them. They'd run until a cabin was seen through the thick pine trees and snow. All the woman could think about was the pain in her feet. The door to the home was shut quickly. Quickly now, onto the couch. The elderly woman gestured, "I'll get you some blankets, dear." She wasted no time hurrying to the soft-looking couch and wiggling onto it. The home was quaint and small, having to climb a miniature staircase from the entryway to the main room. The living room had 2 sofas, comfy chairs, and a fireplace. The coffee table was nearby. It felt like a log cabin, with wood textures and comforting brown walls. The home's lights were a gentle orange. The elderly woman, rushing as fast as she could through her old age, would gently throw blankets on the woman and bundle her up. She'd only seem to relax when she was done. "How are you feeling?" she'd ask. She frowned. "Cold," she muttered, "but the blankets already make me feel better." She nuzzled her cold nose into the sheets. The elderly woman sighed with relief, "Thank Allah." She'd say with a hand against her chest, "I was worried you'd freeze to death." "Who's Allah?" Perhaps a god she doesn't know that the woman worships. Her long hair had to be tidied up and rested on the blankets. "Let me get you some new Thur chocolate." The elder would disappear into the kitchen. As she waited for the woman to return, she would peer around her surroundings more. Paintings of elk silhouettes danced along frames, looking as though they were hoping from one painting to the next. It was pretty cute. Above the tall, grand windows sat a beam with a grand elk trophy attached. She admired how beautiful and regal the animal was despite its life ending long ago. Whoever created it did it with care, love, and dexterous hands. She saw everything through kind glasses, though she didn't know herself. How could you be a stranger to oneself? Just then, the elder came back with 2 steaming mugs. She'd set one on the coffee table and the other on a table next to the couch she sat on. "This'll warm you up much quicker than the blankets," she told her. "Thank you." Her delicate voice rang out, looking at the brown liquid with curiosity. "Oh dear, my manners are lacking," the older woman huffed suddenly, stealing her attention. "My name is Isle, dear. What's yours?" She smiled at Isle, her face beaming from the kindness she was being given. The woman opened her lips to say her name, but her mind blanked. She felt as if she were rasping against a closed door, asking to be let back in, but she never remembered being in there in the first place. Isle appeared concerned as the woman's smile fell. She'd breathe, "I don't know." Of course, the elderly woman's concern only worsens. "You don't remember your own name." She'd whisper, "Oh no, do you remember anything at all?" She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing as hard as she could on remembering anything. Earlier, when she thought of something, it popped into her mind without any evidence or reasoning. As she tried to force a memory, her head began to hurt. Reopening her eyes, her frown deepened. "No," she whimpered. I remembered my favorite flowers are white lilies, but I don't know how." She told Isle honestly, having no reason or desire to lie. "It hurts my head to try and remember." Isle took this information in before sighing. "That's all right." She clasped her hands. "Let's not dwell on it. I don't want you to hurt your head more." Finally calmed down from the cold, although still a little chilled, she'd study the elderly woman some more. Isle's gray hair was long but tied in a neat braid. Her face was wrinkly and showed clear signs of age, but her imperfections made her beautiful. Delicately, the woman took her mug and gently blew on it. It smelled sweet despite its dark appearance and hot nature. Taking a sip, she'd smile. It was really good. The drink's name was on the tip of her tongue, yet she couldn't remember. Suddenly, the opening of the front door distracted the two. The front door swung open. The woman peeked over the couch, having difficulty seeing the door due to the heavy blankets and warm mug of tasty goodness. "Oh, welcome home, dear." Isle greeted, slowly rising from the couch. An elderly man covered in wrinkles slowly climbed the stairs, holding onto the railing. He was completely bald, a gray stubble hugging his strong jaw. Despite his old age, he was incredibly tall and bulged from under his clothing with muscle. He raised his brow once he saw the plump woman sitting on the couch. Isle approached him, putting a hand on his shoulder and leaning up to press a kiss against his lips. He quietly cooed, momentarily distracted, before shaking his head and gesturing to the woman. "Who is this?" He'd rumble. She patted his shoulder before looking at the unnamed woman. "This is Njord, my husband. She said I found this woman outside in the cold. Isle frowned sincerely. She doesn't remember anything but her favorite flower." Njord looked equally concerned. "What about her name?" He frowned when the woman simply shook her head. She was also frowning, unable to ignore the saddening atmosphere. The large man pointed at her drink. "Do you know what you're drinking?" he asked. She glanced down at it, looking at the dark brown liquid. "No," she whimpered, "but I like how it tastes." It was obvious his concerns weren't improving. Isle gestured for him to lean down. She whispered in his ear, which the woman could hear, but they spoke in a foreign language. "Jayo hu hoba h lau f jorther," Isle whispered. He nodded a bit. "Turu hu you da the lu nathai," before clearing his throat and readjusting his posture. "Do you know where you are?" the elderly woman asked, walking up to her and sitting next to her alongside the pile of blankets. Njord stood at the foyer's entrance with folded arms, his massive height towering over them like a lighthouse. She shook her head no. Njord sighed. "You're in Yukon, Canada. This should fit you nicely." Isle cooed. The woman wore a comfortable, bland gray t-shirt that reached her mid-thigh and cozy white sweatpants. The pants were meant for men, but her wide hips made them work. She appreciated their kindness so much she nearly wanted to cry. Walking out of the bathroom, Isle smiled warmly at her while sitting on the couch. "You look adorable, dear." She'd say, "Come, sit on the floor in front of me." While wandering over, Isle kept talking. "Your hair is fntiba fndo," she said, "but it's so long that it drags, which definitely won't do." Isle beckoned to the nameless woman her left hand, revealing a white hair tie made of real rabbit fur. It felt like she was being introduced to a unique culture. She sat down on the floor in front of the elderly woman. Combing her fingers through her platinum white hair, she'd quietly mentioned how soft and beautiful it was a few times. The woman sectioned her hair, taking different sections and crossing them over. She moved the braid up to the upper back of her head, using a comb and hair tie to keep it in place. Her hair was so long that it took a while, but her braid reached her mid-back. Isle took a hand-held mirror and gave it to the woman. Her hair was done in a Dutch braid. "Oh, you look so pretty," she cheered. She blushed furiously, pursing her lips. "Thank you so much." She smiled and leaned closer to the mirror. "I really like it." Watching the elderly woman get up, she walked toward the kitchen. "I'm going to make you something to eat, okay?" Goodness, these people are so lovely. The guest room bed was especially comfortable. They gave her warm blankets and a fluffy pillow, and Isle was kind enough to fetch brand new underwear for her to wear. She nuzzled her nose into the pillow. These people are so kind. She did nothing but wake up in this land, even trespassing in a sacred flower field, but they're housing her. How could she repay this kindness? The woman puffed her cheeks out, flailing her feet under the blanket while lying on her tummy. The worst thing imaginable would be her overusing their generosity. Her attention is taken when there's a commotion outside her room. With the sun shining through the room window, she didn't need the room light to see. Crawling out of the comfortable bed, the woman stretched. Pulling on her gifted sweatpants, she slowly opens the bedroom door and wanders outside. Walking down the hallway, she reaches the living room. Isle and Njord sit on a couch together, talking to another couple on the second couch. A young woman with a muscular physique sat there, her light brown shoulder-length hair delicately dancing in the breeze of a fan. Brilliant golden eyes stared ahead, listening to everything the elder pair said. Beside her sat a similar young man. His light brown hair, draped over his broad shoulders, was long enough to reach his mid-back. He stared on with light blue eyes, but they were more bland and uninterested than the women's. The unknown woman curtly stood up. "Oh, my Ulrhi," she exclaimed, looking at the woman in awe. "You are so balmy." She gushed, "You actually have white hair." She blushed furiously from the compliments. "Isn't she?" Isle agreed happily. Njord smiled softly while the unknown man scoffed. Let's make this quick, he'd say, folding his arms and leaning back on the sofa. His muscles bulged every time he moved. My name is Zisa, the woman introduced, and this is my twin brother On. She smiled softly. It's nice to meet you. The woman folded her hands before herself. I'd tell you my name, but I don't know it. Zisa smiled understandably. I heard about your amnesia. She walked up and gently took her hand, flaring her nostrils for a moment before cusping her hands gently. But we need to call you something, so we thought we could give you a name. She thought about it before nodding. That's a good idea. The gentlewoman cooed. On stood, his monotone voice blaring. I know what a good name would be. He walked up to the two, separating their hands. Zisa scowled at her brother. Lily. He announced, because you woke up in a field of white lilies. Lily is a good name until you remember your real one. Zisa cheered, exclaiming about how cute it was, and Isle mentioned it matched her appearance. The woman, now called Lily, couldn't help but widely grin and giggle. Thank you so much. She'd say, it's so sweet of you to come up with one for me. Honestly, Lily liked it mainly because she appreciated their efforts. Her amnesia heightened her gratitude, considering she doesn't remember the last time someone was kind to her. Well, her new name is Lily. Her black snow boots crunched the snow under each step. She wore warm gray snow pants and a gray puffy jacket with fluffy hems made from rabbit pelt. With her hood down, her Dutch braid was wrapped in a bun behind her head. Due to her long hair, it was big regardless of being tied up. Zisa and On were ahead of Lily, leading her down a snowy pathway that was incredibly used and flattened. The twins were quietly discussing, but communicating in an entirely different language. Gi oda nuku ohai. On would comment. She smells like a dog. Zisa huffed. Da hide, she exclaimed. Gi smells nuku agazi. Zia ohai. Be nice. She smells like a wolf, not a dog. Strangely, Lily found herself slowly translating their words. She furrowed her brows in thought. She didn't actually know what language they were speaking, but she understood. How? Weird. Fnda gi fu oz oda nuku ahu rigazi na hurini tta. But she doesn't smell like a werewolf or werebear. Werewolf? Werebear? Why are they talking about mythical creatures? Lily couldn't help but find them a little weird. She raised her hands and gently slapped her cheeks, squeezing her eyes shut while following the twins. Calling them weird was rude. She didn't say it to their faces, but she disliked thinking rudely of people. During her scolding, the trio finally reached their destination. The plaza was beautiful. Nature was everywhere, but modern architecture and stone pathways stood under her feet. The tall wooden buildings screamed a Nordic aesthetic, but their sharp turns and large windows told her they were rebuilt to be bigger and sturdier. She noticed the largest building amongst them had windows assumably 15 feet tall, its massive double doors wide open with people going in and out freely. Lily followed Zisa and On, who were heading for the building. Zisa slowed down, smiling softly at Lily, before opening her lips. She was interrupted by her brother, though. This is the tribe's communal building. He explained, members can freely go in and out, use its utilities, and leaders prefer to work in the offices or talk in the meeting rooms. The twin sister huffed. I would have explained that better. She muttered. Tribe members looked at her with curiosity, somehow easily able to tell she was a stranger. To be fair, Lily wore more clothing than they did. Perhaps they were just acclimated to the cold. She couldn't help but notice how tall everyone was compared to her. Zisa was tall for a woman, and On was even taller, but everyone shared these ridiculous heights. Perhaps their genes are different from those of the majority of Canadians. What God decided this cruelty was okay. Lily was left to tremble at the surveying eyes of Vor and On, who scrutinized her appearance warily. At this point, Vor had begun to walk around her. She pursed her lips, thinking as she'd eye her from head to toe. She would have thought she was checking her out if it were a better situation. So the woman's deep voice sounded from behind her. Do you truly remember nothing? Lily frowned, raising her hands and rubbing her arms. She was beginning to sweat and get too hot under her winter clothing. Yes, the delicate woman shook her head. I don't remember much to anything. She watches the woman appear in her vision, stepping out from behind her. Vor stepped so close to her Lily was nearly pressed against her chest. Glaring down, lowering her head to her ear, she'd whisper. The da you fnti. Bullshit. Lily was highly intimated. She spluttered. I truly remember nothing, Lily whispered back. Vor scoffed. Clearly, nothing Lily could say would convince her otherwise. Just as the woman was about to scrutinize her further, a large hand planted itself on Vor's shoulder. The muscular Ek flinched violently, eyes widening as she whipped her head to look over her shoulder. A much taller man stood behind her, but definitely not as tall as the cloaked stranger. He had long black hair, pieces of hair tied into braids to create a Nordic Viking haircut, and a short and clean black beard. His eyes were cornflower blue, bright compared to his dark hair. Lily noticed that On had folded his arms behind his back and bowed his head in the background. Vor gritted her teeth and scratched her neck. "Moufoner Rawmow," she muttered. "Good morning," he rumbled with a chuckle. Vor muttered nonsense and finally stepped away. The man was intimidating, but he was much more friendly than Vor. The taller male offered a hand to Lily. "Bald your Fiester, Athel of the tribe." He'd introduce, Alpha of the tribe. Lily beamed. Finally, a nice person. She was beginning to worry that Zisa would be the only friendly person here. She also noticed that she was right earlier. The leader was in fact known as the Alpha. "My name is Lily." She'd beam. "Oh, well, not really." Baldur couldn't help but laugh, his laugh hearty and loud. "Don't worry, I heard about your amnesia," he'd say. How did he hear about it so quickly? "That's actually why you're here." She tilted her head, which only made the Athel grin. "We're here to pass judgment." The raising of Vor's hand made him turn his gaze, and Lily noticed it in her peripheral vision. She seemed to always speak out of turn, but Baldur's presence made her far more respectful. "I don't trust her," Vor explained. "I think she's lying." She even had the audacity to say it in the only language Lily understood. At least to their knowledge. On's bland voice sounded, "I agree." "What?" Lily glanced at the man with parted lips, shocked that he was against her. While she only met him today, On hadn't voiced his suspicions or proven he disliked her. She just assumed he was a man with a cold exterior. He stared at her blankly, his monotone voice matching his eyes. Nothing in his expression could be readable. His words were as hard to understand as his expression. She felt a sense of betrayal from his disbelief in her predicament. Once again, Baldur laughed out loud. It felt different, though. She couldn't understand if he found this funny or if he saw her truth as silly lies. "Well, whatever you may think." He sighs, ridding his cackles yet still smiling. His eyes glance down at her, studying her before she notices a yellow swarm in them. They swirl in his blue irises. Baldur beamed. "She's staying." Shocked silence wavered through the room. Baldur snickers before shoving his large hands into his pelt pockets and turning to leave. "Why?" Vor would exclaim, waving her hands around. On was next. "What is your reason?" He'd ask quickly, just as confused. The man opened the meeting room door. "I'm glad this meeting was short," he said, looking over his shoulder. "I have plenty of things to do today. It's nice to make easy decisions." Vor looked appalled, watching the Athel walk away without a care. "Dickhead," she spat, losing the respect from earlier. "Oh, Riga talking Lutao mate. You're just talking about your mate." Zisa snickered, but a glare from the Ek made her tighten her lips. "The da ufnti," the Ek thundered out of the room, clearly not willing to stay there any longer. "Bullshit." Lily rubbed her arms before nervously looking at the twins. On muttered something under his breath, and Zisa looked at him anxiously. That was quicker than expected. She would say, trying to ease the tension but to no avail. Her brother was clearly irritated but not as explosive as the woman who had just left. He glanced up at the two, expression just as unreadable, before sighing and pinching the bridge of his nose. "Let's just head to the Laknari." He mumbled, "The quicker we do that, the sooner I can practice archery." "Healer." Zisa smiled softly, "Sounds good." On leads the way, but not without muttering, "Ha-ji hihu." Fuck's sake. Oh dear. What has Lily gotten herself into? The twins didn't need to push through crowds as they parted for the F-Jorther with complete respect. Regardless of being third rank, he was still influential amongst the tribe. Zisa had quietly comforted Lily along the way, letting her know they were untrusting and wary. The tribe rarely receives guests, she had said, which Lily appreciated subtly. It was nice that she cared. As they left the community building, the trio began to approach a smaller Nordic modern building nearby. It was more secluded, with well-trimmed bushes and trees surrounding it. "We're going to see the Laknari," the kind woman explained, which means healer. Lily already knew this, but didn't think to tell them she understood their language. On opened the tall door to the building, not waiting to keep the door open for the ladies in tow. Like last time, Zeser rolled her eyes and awaited Lily to come in with her. Either On lacked manners, or his respect for strangers was minuscule. The interior was homely decorated, with many medical supplies, supplements, and herbs gathered along shelves and walls. The little waiting room was cute. On didn't approach the receptionist, who only had to glance up before nodding in acknowledgement. Finally, with some respect, he knocked on a door. After a moment of waiting, in which Lily fidgeted and blew warm air onto her cold hands, the door opened. A petite young woman revealed herself. She was equal in height to Lily and just as pale. In retrospect, the woman had bright ginger hair tied in a tight braided bun. Freckles littered her cheeks and shoulders, which were exposed due to her off-shoulder tan sweater. Her pretty green eyes shone with youth, dimples showing as she smiled, "Good morning, Frither." On shifted his feet, gaze softening. "You can call me On." He'd softly tell her, though it sounded like a gentle reminder. The woman beamed, "I keep forgetting." Lily couldn't help but notice On get anxious in her presence, yet he held a semblance of peace and calmness. The healer's existence did a mix of calming and riling him up, which was quite cute. Regardless of their bad blood, Lily found she adored seeing love unfold. The petite woman welcomed them in, the trio crowding the smaller room and closing the door behind them. She softly grasped Lily's hand. "My name is Ire." She introduced, "It's a pleasure to meet you." Ire? That name reminded her of the kind, elderly woman. Lily smiled. "I'm Lily," she'd say temporarily. Ire giggled girlishly. "Yes, I was quite intrigued to hear about your condition. Perhaps amnesia was uncommon, and I can tell you," her gaze swept her momentarily, "that you're completely fine." Silence enveloped the room. Lily stared at Ire, searching for humor on her face, but she found none. "What?" She furrowed her brows. Zisa chuckled nervously, disliking the new mood. "Ire." She'd start. She doesn't remember her name, origin, or even race. The twin explained cautiously, "There's no way you can just pass this off." The healer sighed, letting go of her hands and returning to sit in her chair. If her amnesia was that severe, she wouldn't be talking or walking right now. The woman explained, "What you're saying is outside the realm of possible." Her logic made sense, but Lily felt hurt and unmotivated due to everyone's disbelief. On seemed pleased with this. "Exactly," he said, "but Baldur wants her to stay." Ire hummed, swaying her feet in her chair. "What Baldur says goes." She huffed. "No one can really tell what that man is thinking. If his wife does, she sure as Gaia doesn't like to show it. Gaia, does this culture have more than one god? Besides, I trust that man." She'd nod, making On purse his lips. "He can talk to Uller himself. He definitely knows something we don't." Zisa beamed. "Absolutely." She exclaimed, "The moment Baldur saw her, he basically already made up his mind." Just as the discussion slowed, Lily fidgeted with her thumbs and decided to finally ask, "Who is Uller?" Thousands of years ago, there lived a man named Uller. The forest was his home and his calling. When he needed to eat, he'd turn toward Earth's land to feed his aching stomach. While he excelled at hunting with a spear, he noticed others begin to realize hunting was too much work for the reward. They did not share Uller's passion. The man watched as more and more people preferred to create villages and farm for their food instead of hunting. They became weaker, smaller, and sicker. His offense gave way for resolve. The man knew he needed to make things right. One day, Uller got to work. Running after your prey was hard work and not rewardable enough. It'd be better if you could stay at a distance. After days of working to the bone, risking the food on his table to find a solution. Yet one day, he watched the moon shine brighter than the sun. As he stared up at it in awe, the realization he needed hit him. He now knew what to do. Raising a curved wooden contraption with a string, he pulled back a stick with a sharpened end and let it go. The tiny spear shot across the clearing and into an elk's heart. This object was what he called the bugan, which later translated into the bow. While using it came to him naturally, others found it difficult to pick up. But Uller had a passion and was more than willing to teach others how to hunt. He'd spend day and night teaching pupils until they'd move on to teach their own pupils. He improved the bow more and more, creating better designs or applying new techniques. His passion hit the hearts of many, who began to see him as a leader, a god. It didn't take long for people to notice his behavior toward hunting and the food he reaped. First, it was his knowledge of nature. Uller strictly avoided killing does unless necessary, especially if they had a fawn. Killing the females meant shrinking the population until there was nothing. He preferred to strip the carcass of the meat while in the field and allow scavengers to take the rest. Second, it was his ability. His sheer understanding of behavior made people cling to every word he spoke. He'd teach about the behaviors of prey animals and how to use that to your advantage, making elk noises, clattering antlers to attract males, or studying migration patterns. Third, it was his respect. Before every meal, Uller would take a moment to thank the animal for its meat. People saw this as humble and courteous, allowing the animal's soul to rest, knowing its death was not for sport. Uller was strict about hunting only for survival, not for profit. And lastly, his passion. Uller's sheer passion for hunting convinced people to join the hunt. When he planned hunting events or classes, the entire village, even people from other villages, would come just to see his skill. They knew he was a man of legend. As time passed on, the man got older. Despite being in his 40s, he was just as powerful. The man was extremely old for his time. During a hunt, he'd follow a beautiful elk buck with antlers larger than his body. Just as he thought he'd corner it in a valley, a figure approached him from the forest's depths. It was a man. Uller could only stand there in shock and awe as a human version of Jord appeared before him. Jord looked upon him with awe and adoration, commending him for his passion. He was doing exactly what Jord wanted, letting the food chain move forward. With that, Jord blessed the man with immortality. Uller gained abilities and power beyond his understanding, able to shapeshift into whatever animal he desired. His age was at a standstill, and his body was as spry as a young man's. People didn't take long to note this and worship him as a god. Uller disliked the concept, but the hope and passion of his people made him allow it. He'd be overwhelmed when he discovered the creation of a religion following his practices and morals. As thousands worshipped him during the years, he watched many births and deaths. Slowly, he had withdrawn himself from society. While they spoke to him and worshipped him, he spent most of his time alone. The loneliness of immortality was beginning to get to him. Yet one day, Uller went hunting. It was the only thing that eased him. As he hunted, he happened upon a figure resting on the grass. Getting closer, he'd recognized this person as the most gorgeous woman he'd ever seen. Her hair was long and beautiful, its white color shimmering under the moon's light. Her pale body was plump and curvy, skin as soft as the grass under his bare feet. She had the grace of an elk and the beauty of the forest. Peering up at him, her eyes held the moon itself in them. They were gentle and innocent like a doe. Something in him told him to corrupt that innocence. Was this lust? He came to know this woman as Selene. Her voice rang like a melody, calming his woes and cooing at his aching heart. When he held her in his arms, it felt like his skin was on fire. At first sight, he knew he wanted her to be his. Uller spent every waking moment attempting to court her. He would meet her at the same spot every night and give her gifts. Cooked food, clothing made from pelt, carved necklaces, and small decorations to remind her of him in her home. While he easily won her affection, that did not stop him from wanting to please her at every turn. It kept his world turning. But he realized his immortality. Pain seeped into his heart, and she knowingly rested her hand on his chest. That was when he learned she truly was a goddess, the moon goddess. He met her wolf, Luna, whom he treated with love and worship, just like how he treated Selene. They were his girls. Selene had lived just as long as he had. The night the moon shined brightest was when she ascended, giving out her gift of the werewolf. He wouldn't have found the inspiration and passion to create the bow if it weren't for her moon. It gave him such joy to know that the woman he fell in love with would live with him throughout the eons. He was truly not alone. When she discovered his people, she wished to gift them with something. Anything she wanted he would allow. Uller always admired her gift of the werewolf, which made the average person a true hunter. He's always admired the wolf Selene gave out her gift, but she noticed something was different. With Uller's influence, his people turned into werebears instead of werewolves. The two gods were in awe of what they had created. With ease, the werebears did not hesitate to welcome her into their religion, and with that, the god of the hunt prevails. She politely and softly clapped her hands after the story. Haji Yue, Zisa cheered, Uller for the win. Fuck yeah, On scoffed, clearly not entertained by his sister's outburst. Can we speed this up? He'd grumble, I've heard this story fardu many times. His sister furrowed her brows, have some respect. She spat, that's our god you're talking about. Lily began to think more about Uller's identity as the twins argued. Honestly, she was a little jealous of the woman in the story. Wouldn't it be amazing to be spoiled by the god of the hunt? Ire. She'd request the woman's attention, the twins continuing to mutter insults and sneers. The petite ginger perked with a smile. Why are the werebears so loyal to the god of the hunt? Lily asked politely. Silence echoed throughout the room. On quickly stepped forward, making Lily step back until she was in a corner. How did you understand that? He spat lowly. Something she didn't think about was that the mention of werebears and werewolves was spoken in their language Hu-Rigazi and Hu-Rini-Tta. The poor woman shivered, eyebrows raising and pupils getting smaller. His larger frame enveloped hers, blocking any possible escape. Lily was terrified. I just did. She waffled. On grabbed the collar of her winter jacket. She specifically said werebear in Liu can. He hissed, there's no fucking way you understand it. The more petite frame of Zisa tried pushing him away. Calm your ass. She exclaimed, you're scaring her. That's the fucking point. He'd yell in her face. Just as things were about to get worse, the door to the room slowly opened. A tall man stepped in, appearing strong but delicate. Everyone eyed him silently, Lily trembling in the corner. Pardon the interruption, Fjorther. The man nodded respectfully. I came to fetch the guest. They kept looking at each other until all eyes landed on the terrified woman. Her lips pursed, eyes widening as she pointed at herself in question. Yes, you, the man smiled kindly. The guest ceremony is ready for you, he explained curtly. For me, she whispered, completely aghast. Lily was shocked that so much was being set up just for her. It was truly an honor, really. Her cheeks were completely flushed red. On quietly seethed and clenched his fists, quietly thinking about the new developments. Zisa quickly stole this moment to push On away and hurriedly begin explaining. We rarely receive guests, she told her, especially ones welcomed by the Alpha. It appeared she wasn't censoring herself in their language anymore, since she understood anyway. He barely fucking welcomed her. On scoffed, his monotone voice breaking through. All he said was that she can stay. The twin sister rolled her eyes, stopped being a bitch for at least a minute. Clasping her hands together, the pale woman smiled warmly, though that feeling of terror still lingered in her heart. Thank you so much for your hospitality. She melancholically cooed, it means a lot to me. The muscular woman patted her shoulder. I'd barely call Vor and On hospitable. Of course, the man at the door was still there. Go without me. Ire spoke up after not talking for a while. I have appointments with all the newborn cubs today. The man smiled, not a bother, Laknari. He'd say, you keep the tribe wheels going. Thank you, Arngrim, the ginger would say, so that was his name. As they prepared to leave, she noticed On look visibly bothered, or perhaps jealous of her kind voice toward the stranger. She didn't know if she should look forward to the ceremony or fear it. Oh, how lovely. Lily was beaming as bright as the sun, swaying her hips and arms happily as Zisa guided her down the halls of the community tribe house. They were on the first floor, where the halls were grander. Antler chandeliers and paintings of past leaders and essential events adorned the walls. She noticed some beautifully done trophies of animals, from geese to meese. Notably, not a single bear was mounted on the walls. When she walked through tall, open doors, she was met with a massive banquet room. Windows lined the walls, along with numerous chairs and tables. Food was scattered across the room, serving platters and bowls of drinks. A few people either sat in chairs or discussed while standing. She noticed that not a single plate was full of food. All the tribe members wore traditional clothing, which seemed to be standard apparel, as normal as a t-shirt. A few tribe members approached her immediately, greeting her excitedly. A tall young man, like the rest, held a hand against his chest and smiled. You're absolutely beautiful. He'd compliment, I've never seen a woman with white hair like yours. Lily ran her fingers through her hair, tied in a high ponytail. Thank you. She muttered, clearly flustered. Zisa stepped in. Hey, she'd huff, you can make friends with her, but no courting. What? Her face lit up in red at this exclamation. A mug is slammed on a table. She flinches, and a few people flinch too, while attention is drawn to the abrupt noise. The cloaked man rose from his chair at a table, his large mug half full of a honey-colored liquid. Taking it with them, he'd push past a few people and walk out the doors leading to the outside from the banquet. Arngrim approaches her. "Don't be too bothered by that," he says, stealing her gaze. "That guy is another guest, we call him Ouku." The man scratches his face. Though he's been here so long, you could consider him a tribe member. Zisa nodded along with him. Yeah, Athel trusts his word like it's the word of Uller himself. She giggled girlishly. He was even the one who invited him as a guest to the tribe, but we don't know why. She threw her hands up. She understood that Ouku was a combination of the words strange and man. "I see," Lily muttered. "How fascinating." Zisa put her hands on her shoulders and pushed her further into the room. "We sit at the chairs at the end," she cheered. "Everyone is pretty hungry. The cooks here are so good." Her enthusiasm was quite adorable, making Lily smile. Sitting down, tribe members seemed to want to be as close to her as possible, but many ended up at a different table. Everyone outstretched their hands, confusing Lily. Zisa took her hand while Arngrim took her other one. Zisa cleared her throat to not overwhelm our guest. "I'll speak for her." Lily listened curiously. "We sit here today, having a delicious meal, but it would be nothing without the animals who gave us their bounty. We thank the caribou, meese, and duck that were hunted for us to feed ourselves." She said in one breath, "Thank you." With that, everyone began to collect their food and eat. She ate caribou, moose, duck, and many fresh vegetables. She'd coo in delight at the taste of honey-covered cooked carrots. "These are so good." She cheered. "You were right, Zisa, always am." The woman beamed. Arngrim sat nearby. "We tend to eat a lot of meat during celebrations." He said, "A lot of the meat is hunted specifically for this dinner, so we always thank the animals for their meat." She found this a very sweet and respectful tradition. "We do this even during regular meals," Zisa explained. During dinner, she would take a sip of her Cassina tea. It was warm and relaxing. "I'm going to take a quick breath of fresh air," she'd gently say, smiling at everyone. She would get up, everyone agreeing and appreciating her need for silence. Lily walked around the table and people up to the door to the outside and stepped out. The door closed behind her. Lily walked a bit until she stood at the bottom of the stone steps. It was incredibly cold outside, but she appreciated the crisp air. However, a presence alerts her. Looking to the side, the cloaked man stood leaning against the wall. His arms were crossed, an expression hidden by the darkness of his hood. "Hello." She greeted the fellow guest kindly. "Ouku, right? I'm Lily." Lily has been curious about his name ever since she first saw him. He pushed himself away from the wall, slowly approaching her. He absolutely towered over her, and she was 5'5". Her head barely reached his shoulders. His heavy breathing caught her ear, making her shiver. "Are you looking to court someone?" His heavy voice was like a bass, making her tense. Butterflies swarmed inside her tummy. It was deep and rough, like a well-seasoned soldier. A furious blush coated her already rosy cheeks, and she shook her head. "No," she nervously said. The cloaked man grunted. "You deserve someone willing to hunt, feed, and keep you warm," he told her thoughtfully, his gaze intense despite her inability to see it. "You need someone capable and strong." He was strangely passionate and jealous. Lily's plump lips parted to say something, but his cloak wavered in the wind as he turned and walked away. She watched his massive frame walk until it disappeared around a corner, large boots leaving imprints in the snow. Who is he? The hallways were wide and empty. Paintings lined the walls, ones that she admired for their beauty and intricate. Lily, whose long white hair waterfalled off her shoulders, held a small bag of clothing. The elderly couple were kind enough to give her clothing they no longer needed. She really appreciated it. Guests stay in the tribe house. Zisa elucidated. She was leading the woman to her room, where she will be staying. Honestly, she'd sigh and slow down a bit to walk beside her. "We don't really know or understand you. That's why everyone is so wary." Lily smiled. "It's okay." She reassured, "I would never expect someone to immediately trust me." She was a kind soul that didn't see the bad in people. It was a mix of a blessing and a curse. Her silky white hair bounced with each step, sometimes requiring her to tuck it over her shoulder so it didn't drag on the floor. Braiding her hair made things easier, but Lily enjoyed the freedom of letting her hair sway in the wind. "Can I?" She thought momentarily before mumbling, "Can I ask something?" "Of course," Zisa cooed. She was a lot more willing to teach than everyone else. Lily adjusted her grip on the bag. "Is everyone here a werebear?" Zisa raised her brows. Well, she translated the words in the story, so it was about time she realized they weren't human. Hiding something detrimental about yourself is basically impossible for long periods like this. "Yeah," she breathed out, puckering her lips. "I am too," she added. The two kept walking down the hallway, a few tribe members passing by with wary or curious looks on their faces. Lily didn't see them as malicious, though. However, her kindness was beginning to have a limit when it came to Vor. She was nasty. "That's a little cool." She'd chirp, tilting her head as she'd think more into it. The twins' eyes narrowed, and an eyebrow raised as she glanced at her curiously. "That's..." She trailed off and started chuckling. "That's the most nonchalant reaction I've ever gotten." Immediately, Zisa is theorizing. "Maybe it's because of your amnesia," she commented. Lily tilted her head in question, which made the woman giggle. "What if you know about werebears without actually knowing? You know, that's confusing." Her nose scrunched up, her pretty features looking unfamiliar under the strange expression. "But I did know about my favorite flower. Maybe you actually have a point," she muttered. Finally, the two stopped at the door. It was tall and grand, twice the plump woman's height. "It seems she's living in a building meant for giants." She opened the door and allowed Lily to walk in first. A comfortable, modern Nordic room lay before her. Paintings of mountains and forests lined the walls, along with the large bed facing the colossal window. "Oh, it's lovely." She cooed as if it were the most adorable thing she's seen all day. The further Lily went in, the more she realized how large the furniture and ceilings were. The room was obviously meant for large occupants, and the absolutely massive Wyoming king-sized bed. The sheets were luxurious and soft. "I'll have to go." Zisa smiled. "Have a good night. Hopefully tomorrow is less scary." "Thank you." Lily set her small bag on the humongous bed. "Good night, Zisa." For the first time that day, she was entirely left alone. Not a single eye glanced at her, allowing Lily to collapse on the bed and relax in the soothing silence. Wiggling further onto the bed, she glanced at the large window ahead of it. The waning gibbous moon shimmered in the night sky, yet it was much darker than bright. Waning gibbous. She whispered, "How did I know that?" The pale woman quickly removed her winter clothing, dropping some of it to the floor. She was left in only her underwear, pulling off her bra and tossing it aside. Her breasts went limp, the cold nipping at her exposed body, but it felt so lovely to be free. But it was chilly. Lily wiggled under the sheets as fast as possible, the sheets as cold as the room. She hid under the blanket until her little nose poked above the hem. The bedroom was perfect, but why did it feel like something was missing? The pale young woman tugged on dark brown reindeer pelt trousers. Tightened buttons tightened the garment around her curvy figure. She tucked in a white blouse she had been given and lifted a large cowl. The fluffy rabbit fur was knitted together beautifully, wrapping around her neck and cascading off her shoulders. She had wrapped her incredibly long hair in a knot bun, which was heavy on the back of her head but rested on the cowl. Lily smiled, folding her gifted clothing into neat piles. She had also made her own bed this morning. The room door swung open. She yelped in surprise, flinching and whipping around to look at the intruder. Vor stood in the doorway. She wore a wool black turtleneck and a thick vest hugging her superframe. Her black trousers were tight and dense to keep her warm. Her calloused hand leaned back, slowly closing the door behind her. Lily frowned, fidgeting with her thumbs. Hello," she greeted. "Was this how she dies? Don't hello me." She spat, copying her tone to make her appear high-pitched and annoying. "How the fuck do you understand Liu Can?" The woman demanded through hisses, stomping toward Lily maliciously. She shrank into herself, playing with the hem of her cowl. "Who the fuck are you?" Vor got up in her grill. "I don't know," Lily puffed. "I'm serious." "I don't know why I understand." The woman's hand flew to her neck. Her large fingers held it tight, nails digging into her skin. Lily gasped, hands flying up to grab her wrists, but it did little to save her from being thrown to the floor. She fell with a thump, choking in pain and lack of oxygen. "Liar!" Vor roared, shaking a fist at her. "What's your motive, you dumb bitch? Don't play innocent." She wished she could tell her everything, but she really knew nothing. "I don't," she gasped for air, "know anything." Lily choked out. Tears bowled at her eyes until they cascaded down her cheeks from asphyxiation. I heard everything from the Laknari, Vor said, walking up to her and pressing her boot into her stomach. If you truly forgot everything, you wouldn't be functioning. You'd be crying like a newborn cub. Her eyes narrowed. Though it seems that last part is already happening. Lily gaped for air, trembling as she continued to cry. Her lungs screamed and squeezed for oxygen, desperately grabbing onto any pieces of oxygen she could get in. She started to paw and claw at Vor's wrists. What the hell is her problem? There was nothing she could do to prove Vor wrong. Please, it's the truth, Lily hoarsely told her. The boot on her stomach dug into her, Vor stepping further into her. Bullshit. What did she want her to tell her? It all felt so useless. Vor quietly hissed through her teeth as Lily dug her fingernails into her skin, scratching at her like a wild beast. Black blobs appeared in the edges of her vision, the edges of objects and Vor's figure becoming foggy and blurred out. Her head felt like a deflating balloon. The high stakes were interrupted by the jiggling of the doorknob. Occupied, Vor roared, intending to make the interruption go away as soon as possible. Lily felt the urge to yell out for help, but the lack of air bubbling in her lungs made it impossible to speak. That didn't stop the door from jiggling until it was thrown open. The familiar sound of a 7'2", 350-pound man's boots made her heart skip a beat. Heavy boots stepped into the room. She glanced up, still struggling under the grasp of Vor, hope swirling in her eyes at the stranger. Lily had only seen the man twice, but the sound of his heavy steps and breathing was ingrained into her memory. While you'd think it was out of fear, it was out of comfort and familiarity. Leave this instant, the woman gripping her spat. The stranger ignored her, stepping in further. Unhand her, he growled, his bass voice rumbling angrily. Vor immediately let go of Lily. Her lungs puffed up as she gasped for air, her heart thundering in her chest. The fog lifted from her mind and her vision quickly returned to normal. She held a hand to her chest as she rolled onto her side. It was hard to get her bearings. That waist-terrifying. The ex stepped ahead until she was inches away from the cloaked man. Despite having to look up at him, her expression was tightened in irritation. She tightened her fists by her side. How do you know something was going on here? She hissed. Huh, he kept his composure, though Lily couldn't see his face properly to know. He didn't answer the woman. An ek assaulting a guest. He rumbled, wonder how Baldur will feel. Lily's eyes widened as she watched Vor begin to convulse. Her skin got tighter, hair was growing under her, and she was now straining clothing. The ek's legs wobbled beneath her. Her chest heaved and she breathed roughly. She was losing her cool, her hand flew up, but he grabbed it in the span of a second. Through ragged breathing, she muttered something in Liucan. Lily couldn't hear it, but the man would scoff in response. If you shift, Baldur will hear you. Vor held her breath. The man rumbled, you'll be punished for shifting in front of a guest. She yanked her wrist out of his grasp, stepping back as her body stopped, convulsing her stretched clothing lax. Ha-ji Ju. Vor snapped, attempting to shove the man as she walked past. He didn't move an inch. Fuck you. It seemed the man knew exactly how to control her. Finally, she stomped out of the room in a huff. The woman slammed the door shut once she was gone. Lily silently adjusted her cowl, body aching from the prior assault. She felt the ground shift as his heavy steps sounded. The man approached her and crouched down. Thank you, she muttered, but he quietly shushed her. No need. His heavy voice was soft, almost delicate, but it was nothing compared to what she had heard earlier. His large hand reached into the depths of his cloak, pulling out a small cloth. She tensed as he leaned forward, using his hand to wipe away her tears. Lily couldn't help but lean into his touch. The warmth and comfort he admitted made her swoon. Someone like you shouldn't have to shed tears. He whispered delicately. Lily was in awe of his gentleness. He was like a gentle giant, treating her like a glass sculpture that could shatter in a simple graze. Wiping her face until it was clean, he sighed and studied her expression. Her behavior is staggering, the man commented. Lily frowned and shifted to sit up, her chest and neck continuing to ache from Vor's assault. Feeling her neck with her delicate fingertips, Lily noticed the finger indents. Tusk, the cloaked man huffed, leaning a hand toward her but pausing midair. She stared at him, pondering what he would do, but he sheathed his hand and rested it against his knee. It was impossible to decipher what he was thinking. The man was a walking enigma. His origin, real name, appearance, and personality were utterly mysterious. She couldn't get a read on him. Suddenly, he reached into his cloak and ruffled around. Before she could ask, he pulled something out. The stranger took a bundle out of his cloak. A caribou pelt was carefully tied together with a string. He'd offer it to her, his hidden gaze peering at her gently. She took it with both hands, looking down at it in fascination. "Is this a gift?" she asked softly, peering up at the stranger. He nodded curtly. Pulling away the string, she unfolded the pelt to gaze at what it hid. Dark red and brown beads were tied together to form a necklace, the small tip of an antler tied at its bottom. The piece of jewelry was handmade, but she struggled to imagine him making something so beautiful with his massive hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered, grazing her fingertips along the antler piece. It was real. Looking up at him, he appeared to tense under her gaze. Lily wished more than anything that she could see his face. "Why are you giving me this?" she'd ask, not ungrateful but curious. Lovely women deserve a man that can protect and care for them. He began, lowering his crouch to sit on the ground. He was hunched over but still towering over her smaller frame, to keep them warm, fed, and safe. Lily's face lit up red at his indirect compliment. "I made that for you," he rumbled, clenching and unclenching his fists as if he were fidgeting. "Thank you," she beamed. That's so generous of you. This makes me so happy." He watched as she tied the necklace around her neck, letting it hand over top her cowl so it could be seen. "You're adorable," she blurted. He tensed further, breath catching at her sudden compliment. "I'm not adorable," he quickly argued. "I'm a hunter. I hunted that deer and sawed off that antler with my own 2 hands. He'd explain, slightly leaning toward her as he did everything to convince her otherwise. Lily giggled girlishly, smiling brightly. "You're right," she agreed. "Doesn't stop you from being cute, though," she added. The cloaked man leaned back and muttered incomprehensibly. It wasn't that hard for her to tell he was getting adorably flustered. Something about seeing a massive man get flustered from her comments empowered her. Was he trying to show how capable he was? Maybe he wanted to grab her interest. So far, she has learned that he is absolute husband material. "What's your name?" she asked eagerly, slightly leaning toward him. He leaned toward her but quickly pulled himself back after the unconscious action. He stammered, "I can't tell you that." She frowned, which seemed to upset him. "I'd tell you a fake one," but he turned his head to look down. "I don't have the heart to do that." Oh God, he was such a sweetheart. Lily couldn't help but wonder why he felt such conviction and loyalty toward her. This was their 3rd meeting, and he appeared to be slightly clingy. She was beginning to think that they knew each other suddenly. His much larger and calloused hands rose. His fingertips grazed her cheeks and jaw before he rested his palms on them. Lily's face got extremely red, the tips of her ears brightening. Her pale skin didn't help hide her flustered nature. The stranger rumbled with a chuckle, making her heart skip a beat. I can't describe why," he muttered, taking his hands away from her face to her dismay, "but I can ease some curiosities." Her brows raised before furrowing in confusion. She watched his fingers grasp the hem of his hood. His fingers grasped the hems of his hood. The man pulled it down, letting it fall down the back of his head. Lily's heart picked up, eyes tracing up and down his facial features to desperately memorize them. The soft lights of the room kissed his tan skin. A dark brown beard hugged his sharp jaws, and brown hair tied into tight braids against his scalp lined his head. They disappeared into his hood, bundled over the rest of his cloak. The stranger's eyebrows were narrowed, and his sharp cerulean eyes were gazing up and down her figure with a familiar hunger. Lily slowly raised a hand, pausing for permission, and traced the scar on his nose bridge. Her fingers moved to graze another scar on his cheek. Even his hands were covered in scars. Untold stories covered his entire body like that of a Viking. Another scar slightly parted into his beard like a sea of hair. Slowly looking further down, she couldn't help but stare at his full lips. Lily withdrew her hand before she got ahead of herself. He flexed his jaw, his eyebrows softening and slowly raising his forehead. After this big reveal, all he had to say was a simple grunt. "Why do you hide your face?" she asked. Hoping to raise his confidence, thinking he was self-conscious, she added, "You're really handsome." The man tensed again, pursing his big lips for a moment. "Thank you," he muttered. I don't want to talk about it. That's okay, she smiled. His hand raised to graze his fingers against her neck. She'd wince feeling him touch the red marks caused by Vor's assault. The man's eyebrows furrowed and his eyes narrowed. He clicked his tongue in distaste, Hoppo. He hissed, bastard. Lily found it interesting that he spoke Liu Can. How long has he been here? She gently rested her hand on his. It's a little sore, but it's okay now. She reassured him softly. He didn't appear convinced, though. You're sure? He muttered lowly, raising his hand to tuck a strand of white hair behind her ear. I'm sure, Lily whispered. After a subtle pause, Lily leaned further toward him, hearing his breath waver as she did this. Can I ask you something? She'd tilt her head, watching his brows rise and eyes sparkle when he saw her cute movement. Of course, he'd whisper seemingly without thought. Why are you always so jealous? She asked straightforwardly. You're kind of like, protective, Lily added. The man hummed, tucking another strand behind her other ear. He gazed down at her lips briefly before focusing on her eyes. You're beautiful and attractive. He'd purse his lips. You're hard to resist. But that means I'll have competition. Lily felt her heart pick up, pounding in her ribcage as her breath hitched. The blush on her cheeks was as hot as an oven. He was more straightforward than she could ever imagine being. She felt a familiar comfort in him. Being so close to him made her feel safe, but Lily wanted to be closer. Can I hug you? The woman blurted. His eyes widened, obviously not expecting this. Of course. He immediately breathed. Finally, Lily could lean forward wholly. She tightly wrapped her arms around his large torso, tucking her nose into his cloaked chest. He hooked his hands under her thighs, hauling her onto his lap and gripping her securely. He grunts, breathing picking up, but she hid her hands under his cloak and soothingly rubbed his back. The man hid his face in the crook of her neck. His smell overwhelmed her, and he held her in an embrace as warm as his. He smelled of cedar and a warm fire like a warm cabin in the woods. She'd love nothing more than to smell this scent forever. Her gentle touching made his breathing slow, his heartbeat matching hers. She felt his hands trail up from her thighs, tracing over her bottom and onto her hips. The man grunted again, gripping her hips tightly. Immediately, her heart rattled in her ribcage, and her face brightened with redness once again. Hot lips tickled the red skin of her skin, warmly pressing a sweet kiss. UFNTI, he muttered. She felt his lips against her neck, teeth biting down on his bottom lip. The man shifted under her, something hardening under her. Shit. Lily gasped when he lifted her off his lap, angling his head away and averting his eyes. Sorry, Lily, he muttered. Confused, she watched him stand up, raising his hood and using his cloak to hide his body. He cleared his throat. Have a good day. She narrowed her brows and watched him turn around and curtly leave the room, politely closing the door behind him. What was that? What is your favorite thing to eat? Lily sat in the familiar room of the healer's building. The fluorescent light shined above, the sun glimmering through the large window. Frost clung to its edges, imprinting itself as if it were desperate to invade the indoors. The woman's eyes fluttered shut, long white lashes pressed together. Her eyebrows narrowed, and her nose scrunched up more and more as she dug into the depths of her mind. It was hers, but it was foreign. It felt like clambering through a bedroom at night, trying to remember its details, but the room was a guest room of your own house. You hadn't had the time to memorize the furniture. All she could do was bump into its walls, stub her toe, and hit her head on bedposts as she tried to recall its appearance. Her forehead ached as if her brain was swelling against her skull. The woman winced and held her head. I don't know, she muttered. Without opening her eyes, she heard the scratching of a pen on paper. Okay, Ire hummed. How about, what are your feelings on white lilies? That one was easy. They were her favorite. Of course, she squeezed her shut eyes. I grow them. They prefer partial shade and light watering, just enough for the soil to stay damp. She lost her train of thought. I don't remember what I was going to say. There was more scratching on paper before Ire spoke. That was new information, though. She slightly praised. Think of what a white lily looks like. Tell me what you see in that image. That was an interesting tactic. Lily tilted her head up, imagining a white lily. It's under moonlight. She'd say I had been watching grow in a field. I planted them all a very long time ago. Lily would tilt her head to the side. She dug more into the image, thinking of every detail. The more she created this image in her head, the more she began to recognize it as a memory. I like to watch them in his arms. She smiled. He knows they're my favorite. Suddenly, pain stung through her head like a stinging wasp. She doubled over in her chair, eyes flying open. Lily whimpered painfully. Oh, she whined pitifully, holding her head. Ire quickly grabbed a glass cup. Here, drink, she offered. Lily gladfully took the glass, recognizing it as water and giving quick chugs. The cold and tasteless liquid cooled her throat and eased her mind. She noticed Ire frowning while looking at her eyes searching her expression as if that would solve her mysteries. Let's stop here for today. The Laknari would say, I don't want to exhaust you. That was very kind of her, yet she couldn't help but feel unmotivated by the confusing results. I'm going to do further research on amnesia patients, she explained, resting her notepad and pen on the table behind her. Honestly, this is completely out of my wheelhouse, but I devote my teachings from Jord to Uller and his people no matter what. Well, that's interesting. Perhaps healers also worshipped Jord while dedicating themselves to Uller. Bidding the ginger farewell, Lily left the healer's building. Standing outside, the crisp, cold air made her long white hair dance. She noticed numerous bears wandering the tribe village. They were shades of brown, some dark but not dark enough to be black. As Lily studied the bears, they looked so fluffy she could practically melt. They clambered around, walking in groups to patrol or do daily exercises. They were the size of cars, easily able to crush a human with little effort. She knew these were werebears, thus, a lot bigger than your average grizzly. They were given the okay to shift freely. Lily flinched violently, whipping her head to look at Zisa standing beside her. She wore a long cowl that reached her forearm, wearing baggy winter clothing underneath. You startled me, she said softly, calming her pounding heart. Zisa giggled mischievously, I know. However, she thought about her statement. Why were they unable to do it before? She'd ask. Zisa led Lily away from the building, walking through the plaza. We never know if guests know the werebear's existence. She explained, we're less cautious around werewolves, though. Why is that? She asked. Zisa snorted. I mean, they shift too. Oh, well, that's self-explanatory. She watched a large werebear stand on its hind legs, sniffing the air and eyeing its surroundings. He was absolutely massive even with her amnesia. She could see he was way too big for a normal bear. She'd softly hum, eyeing his massive stature and fluffy pelt. His appearance reminded her of something. Closing her eyes, the image of a much larger bear appeared. He was a dark caramel brown with a lighter brown snout and cerulean blue eyes. Her eyes fluttered open, lips slightly parted as she'd mutter. Bjorn, Lily whispered. HM, Zisa hummed, her hands entangled behind her back as she looked at Lily. What was that? She scratched her white-haired head, eyebrows furrowing in thought. Bjorn. What was the significance of that? Nothing, Lily reassured softly. Yet her head began to ache. As she was stuck in thought, a large figure loomed over her. Zisa perked at the sudden introduction of a challenger while Lily was broken from her daydreaming. Gentle chocolate eyes gazed down at her. You must be the guest. You must be the guest. A light pink spread across her cheeks, though the rosiness could be excused by the cold weather. She clasped her hands. Oh, she spluttered, hello. The taller man had lean muscle and peach skin shimmering under the sun's gentle light. His short crew-cut hair was dirty blonde, lighter than his chocolate eyes. He rumbled with a chuckle, the rumors are true. He smiled, you are very cute. Oh dear. Lily definitely wasn't as confident as she was around the cloaked man, so these compliments definitely weren't helping. Thank you. She fidgeted nervously. He approached her, his French vanilla scent wafting over her. The name's Hydron. He introduced, offering a hand, EU Ruhu. She didn't know what that meant. It sounded like slang. Zisa folded her arms and rolled her eyes, muttering incomprehensibly under her breath. Lily nervously took his hand. My name is Lily. At this point, she had given up on explaining it might not be her real name. He took her hand and planted a kiss on the back of it, making her light up a brilliant red. No more excuses, now Hydron appeared pleased with her reaction. I'm the Jotha for the tribe. He'd explain. Hydron politely let go of her hand, letting her retract it into her chest. Leaning over her shoulder, the she-bear whispered in her ear, you'd call him a specialized chef in English. She translated, or hibernation chef. Lily nodded, smiling at Zisa appreciatively. When she grasped Hydron's hand, something about his touch made her think of the cloaked man. "What does the hibernation chef do?" she'd ask. He beamed. "I'm glad you asked." He laughed. "How about I show you? I'll make you something in the tribe's community kitchen." He jabbed a thumb in the direction of the building. How kind. He was far more welcoming than most of the other people here, so she was thrilled to make more friends. Zisa scoffed and tapped her foot, patting Lily's shoulder. "Fupo Hyage." She'd bid. "Warm trips." Hydrun kindly led Lily into the community building, passing a few tribe members before entering two large doors on the first floor. The door was labeled as the kitchen, clear as day. It was incredibly tidy, almost homely. There were multiple ovens, fridges, and freezers across the room. Utensils lined the walls, and pots and pans were hidden in the cupboards. The familiar modern Nordic style continued on in the kitchen, obviously common throughout the building. She admired the room while Hydrun got comfortable tying a plain black apron around his waist. "How cute. Any food you don't like?" He'd hum, opening the fridge and looking through the stock. This is where Lily thought for a moment but came up with nothing. "I don't know." She sighed, sick with the topic of her amnesia today. "That's all right." Hydrun hummed, taking the hint. The tall man pulled out numerous ingredients, including spices and utensils. Lily sat on a stool, wiggling until she was comfortable. The woman watched in awe as he expertly cut the ingredients up. He was quick and precise. Lifting her nose, she sniffed the air as the meat sizzling sounded. He'd spice it as it sizzled, beginning another pan to cook some unseeable vegetables. The delicious smell wafted into her nostrils, making her stomach grumble. "As Esjotha, I cook food during the tribe's hibernation months." Hydrun suddenly began to explain, not looking at Lily. "Hibernation is where females fatten up and settle down while they go through the first half of their pregnancies." She'd tilt her head, finding this concept fascinating. "What if they aren't pregnant?" she'd ask. "Some women choose to hibernate anyway, some choose not to." He explained, "A few men tend to hibernate alongside the women, though they tend to do that to tend to their needs. Similar to what I do." She hummed curiously, swaying her feet on the high stool. "So you spend the months feeding pregnant women with strange cravings." Hydrun let his head back and rumbled with a laugh, chest shaking from its humor. "That's a pretty good explanation." Every time she learns more about this culture, it gets more fascinating. These tribe people had a beautiful community of loving mothers, mates, and cheerful children. It was so lovely. A plate was placed in front of her. It was a plate of duck, cooked carrots, and green beans. "There you are." Hydrun smiled proudly. "Thank you," she cheered. Digging into it, the taste of the duck made her swoon. It was quite good, maybe even one of her favorites. The taste of the carrots was joyful because everyone enjoyed cooked carrots, yet she'd pause when she got to the green beans. Strangely, Lily did not feel excited about it. Digging into it anyway, Lily pursed her lips and hid her feelings under the surface. The green beans weren't poorly made or sour, but she didn't like them. Seems she just rediscovered her least favorite food. This was delicious. She cooed, "Thank you so much for making it for me. It's best not to tell him about the green beans." Hydrun leaned against the counter backward, wiping off his hands with a cloth. "Of course." He smiled, flashing her a wink. Yet regardless of his clear flirting, it only reminded her of the cloaked man. Lily walked down the hallways, a bright smile uplifting her face. She felt comfortably full after the meal, though she had to wash down the taste of green beans. They tasted strangely sour and had a crunchy taste she hated. Nothing could make her like them. Unfortunately, her amnesia made her forget her immense hatred for them. She definitely needed a nap. Opening her bedroom door, the light from the hallway streamed into the dark room. Stepping inside, she flicked on the light and shut the door behind her, though Lily didn't hear the click. She tried pulling it shut, but it wouldn't fully close. With a sigh, Lily turned around and looked at the ground. A large boot kept the door from closing. Letting go of the doorknob, the door began to slowly agape. Trailing her gaze up the boot, to the leg, and the face of the person, it was quickly revealed to be the cloaked man. Her heart fluttered under his gaze. Oh, she held her breath. Hi. No other man made her feel the same way he did. MMM. He hummed, stepping through the doorway. He was so close to her that she was nearly pressed against his chest, his scent swarming her senses and blurring her morals. Leaning down, he stuck his nose near her neck and curtly sniffed. He'd huff in distaste. "Do I smell bah?" she'd begin, but was interrupted when he pushed her further into the room. He pulled the door shut behind him. Now she is fully pressed against him. Her heart pounded and clenched in her chest, lungs screeching for air as if she was suffocating under his smell. He rumbled pleasingly, his hands flying down to grab her thighs. "You smell like an unmated man." He'd jealously snarl, clenching her clothed thighs tighter. He didn't do anything, did he? He pressed his forehead against hers, cerulean eyes staring into her soul. He made me food." Lily muttered, gripping his cloak as she looked up at him. He was being nice? What'd he make? Well, he's a little nosy. Duck, carrots, and green beans, he scoffed and grimaced as soon as she said the last vegetable. "You hate green beans. I could have made you something better." Lily's lips went agape, eyes widening. His gaze flickered down to her plump lips before staring at her eyes. "How?" she whispered. The man clenched his jaw and pressed a finger against her lips, SHH. He shushed gently. He hooked his hands under her thighs, patting them before raising her. Lily gasped, squirming slightly as he walked up to her bed and dropped her on it. Sitting on it, he placed a hand on either side of her and leaned down. "I told you how I feel, doll." He muttered, "Am I going to have to start fending off other men? Holy shit." She held her breath, clenching her thighs shut. "No," she whispered. He fully pulled his hood off, letting her see his face more clearly. A dark, mischievous emotion swarmed in his eyes, glancing between her face, lips, and thighs. "No wonder they're all over you." He muttered, licking his lips. She gasped when the back of his fingers traced over her clothed breasts, barely grazing them. She found herself leaning into his touch, breathing an anticipating moan. "Pow," he groaned, squishing his thumb into her breast. God, Lily couldn't help herself. Her hands flew up to grip the collar of his cloak, pulling him closer and smashing her lips into his. He gasped in surprise but quickly sank into it. Lily kept pushing into him, wiggling to feel warmth until he pushed her into the mattress and pinned her down. Their lips moved rhythmically, tongues flicking out to wrestle greedily. He twisted to lay beside her, their limbs tangling together. Their saliva and breath mixed like a deadly potion, making something addicting. She savored the taste of his mouth, memorizing every little detail. The green beans from earlier were long forgotten. Pitiful whimpers left her as his hands scoured her body, groping her curves and squeezing her chubby features. It felt like he was exploring familiar terrain he hadn't seen in a long time. He knew where to touch, but his greedy fingers told her he hadn't indulged in a long time. Her lungs screeched for oxygen, and it seemed his did too. The man pulled away, though the taste of his mouth lingered on her taste buds. He panted lightly, hazy eyes tracing and memorizing her features adoringly. "That's a good girl," he muttered. Heat pooled at the bottom of her stomach, making her clench her thighs tightly. Her heart was hammering like a fast thunderstorm. She was silently pleading for more to go further and further. Lily raised her knee and pressed it against his crotch, making him rumble with a moan. "No." He pushed her knee away, making her whimper. "Not yet, doll. Please," she pleaded. The man winced in thought, his expression making it obvious he wanted to indulge himself. Lifting himself with his elbows, he pressed a warm kiss against her forehead. "Don't worry, Neve. I just need to pace myself." Love. Where were these pet names coming from? Lily watched with a frown as he got up and began to walk away. He seemed reluctant to leave, but something was clearly stopping him from doing more with her. She couldn't help but feel a little heartbroken. But his boundaries were as important as her own. He stopped before opening the door. "When other men flirt with you," he began, glancing over his shoulder, "I want you only to be able to think about my kisses." Sky blue blank eyes gazed on, appearing tired and lazy. On covered his mouth with his hand to loudly yawn. It was 5 a.m. when he was abruptly awoken by tribe soldiers about a strange man on their land. Big balls on those soldiers. On was known for being a huge bitch in the morning, so much so that they tend to call him Sleeping Beauty. He tends to operate monotonely and boringly, walking around as if nothing on earth was worth his time. His twin sister always told him that she hoped he'd meet his mate so he would feel some joy in his life. He walked through the forest, completely barefoot and only wearing his pajamas. If they were going to wake him up so early, this was the best they would get. Have some self-respect. A deep feminine voice spat. On stared blankly and rubbed his eyes. "I'm exhausted." Vor scoffed and rolled her eyes. The two finally reached the place where the soldiers found the intruder. Approaching On and Vor would gaze upon a tall man. It was clear from his scent that he was a werewolf. His skin was pale and sickly. The man had messy dark brown hair and a stubble growing out. Murky swamp green eyes gazed at the two, a mysterious malice swarming in them like a swarm of wasps. He stood there in a black suit, covered in gold buttons and decorations, a cloak hanging from his shoulders. On gazed down and noticed him clutching a small, ornate box. It was a dark cherry brown with gold emblems. "Why are you here?" Vor snarled, resting her hands on her hips. The man eyed her before narrowing them. "I have business with someone on your land." His voice was deep and grave, something about it made On feel a sense of doom. For some reason he couldn't speak up. His blank expression hid the emotions swarming in his heart. "Who?" Vor demanded. "That is not for you to know," the stranger would say. That's a good way to piss Vor off. Flaring his nostrils, the scent coming from the ornate box wavered through. The stench was disgusting, reminding him of a rotting carcass. On's face scrunched up in disgust. It reeked of gore. What the fuck was in that box? On finally spoke up. "I don't think you should be on our land." He monotonely mentioned, indirectly suggesting he leaves. "We can tear apart a mutt like you in seconds." Vor hammered the point home, gesturing at him with violent motions. "Leave." With a scoff, the stranger turns around and lumbers into the morning fog. "Thank you, Ire. Until next time." Lily left the healer's hut, closing the door behind her. Today was particularly chilly, the crisp air making her nostrils burn. She had been attending more check-ins with Ire, hopefully trying to uncover more about her past. There hasn't been much progress, leaving Lily feeling unmotivated and defeated. Most of her self-discovery came from the cloaked man, who has been showering her with gifts daily. He's been a godsend for his mental health. She discovered that she absolutely loved the taste of bison meat. He has been showing off his cooking prowess, proving he was better than Hydron. She promised he had no competition, but it seemed something still told him there was. He even began to gift her handmade clothing. She currently wore a comfortable jacket made from alpaca wool. "Lily," a voice called out. She turned to look, watching a blonde, short-haired man wander up to her. "Good morning, Hydron." She greeted gently. He smiled at the sound of her voice. "How was your check-in?" Lily adjusted her jacket. It was okay, she'd say, though deflating with a grim expression. "I feel a little hopeless, though." He patted her shoulder, making her tense. "Lighten up," he reassured her. "You're slowly remembering things, right? Progress is better than no progress." Hydron rubbed her back soothingly, but only made her think of the cloaked man. He was right, his kisses were perfect at ingraining him in her mind. It was hard to forget a man who could make her unravel and beg with little effort. As Hydron lowered his hand and opened his mouth to talk, a hand roughly grasped Lily's wrist, looking over with a startled gasp. On stood there with his hand on her. He appeared tired, but an unexplainable emotion drowned in his bleak eyes. "You're needed," he rumbled, yanking Lily as he began to walk. Oh, Lily's brows furrowed. Do you mind not touching me?" On stared her down, but slowly let go of her wrist. She turned to look at the cook. "Goodbye, Hydron." She'd wave. "Sorry." He chuckled. "It's all right," he reassured, shoving his hands into his pockets as she got further and further away, though. Lily couldn't help but notice his expression slowly shifting into that of worry. She didn't want to suffer his or Vor's wrath, so she followed On. They sped up the stairs, her legs getting wobbly and weak from exhaustion. She needed to exercise more. Lily noticed he wore an expression of irritation, features slightly scrunched up. It was strange to see On wandering around with anything but blankness or tiredness on his face. Finally, they reached the meeting room she had been in once before. As expected, Vor awaited her in the room. The muscular woman tapped her foot, clearly impatient. "There she fucking is." The woman spat as the two entered the room. Lily shrank into herself. On glanced at the white-haired woman. "This is all some ruse," he claimed. "It's clear as day." Vor scoffed. "What's your goal, huh?" Lily fidgeted till she tried to say something, but Lily decided it wasn't worth her breath. There was nothing that'd convince this woman otherwise. Bullshit. It's been a while since she was yelled. It seems she has a lot to catch up on. "Faye, no," Baldur exploded, speaking in Liu Can. "Nifu Jilo." He screamed, waving his arms around Vor. "Oll Dabo, sacrilege, Vor, you will die." In bear form, the Ek stumbled back, holding his paws to his stomach while standing bipedally. The massive bear halted his assault while his opponent shifted into human form. "Baldur!" She was completely nude, making Lily advert her eyes. Hody fu and ju thurai. What do you mean? All the Athel did was repeat himself. Nifu jilo. Sacrilege. On stepped around her as she gaped at them, not wanting to see anything more. Things were far too overwhelming. She felt the ground shake, thumps getting closer and closer until a fluffy warmth wrapped around her. Lily squealed in shock, flailing and squirming in the tight grasp. The larger bear had picked her up with his large paws, holding her to his fluffy chest. A cloak was wrapped around his neck, telling her this was the cloaked man in bear form. Hodiero fu yu. She unconsciously spoke Liu Can. W, what are you doing? Just as Baldur began to talk to Vor, she was hauled out of the room. The bear ran out like an Olympic runner, bolting around corners and descending stairs until he stopped in front of a door. Halfway through, he began to run on one front paw. The walls shook with every thundering step the giant took. She felt his rage radiate from him like a heater. Bones snapped, and skin ripped, a lot more disgusting sounding now that she was up close. Lily held her hands over her ears. The sounds stopped. Opening her eyes, the man was now crouched over her. His cloak did a good job at covering him, but she got a good enough view to see his toned body and tattooed left pec. His handsome face looked down at her cerulean eyes, gazing into her soul. The same dark look swam in them. He hooked his arms around her torso and carried her into the room, closing the door behind him with his bare foot. Clutching onto him, Lily couldn't help but feel embarrassed due to his obvious nudity. If I have to cover you in my scent to protect you. He narrowed his eyes, so be it. What? He tossed her onto a large bed. She noticed the room appeared to be his. Different pelts littered the room, and a half-finished trophy of an elk sat on the desk. That and his soothing scent drugging her like the smell of a baking pie. May I? He rumbled. Lily felt like swooning at his question. Asking for consent had to the sexiest thing a man could do. He treated her like a goddess. After his mauling, the man had cleaned her up, dressed her in some of his clothing, and massaged her back. Was he a god? She knew he was sweet, but he was adorably sweet. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to cuddle him to sleep. He had brought her to her room and tucked her in for the night. She pleaded for him to stay, but he told her he had unfinished business. Lily wasn't stupid, though. Vor was definitely screwed. The woman lay in her bed. Her long white hair was tied in a loose braid, which he had done for her. It was soft and shiny from her bath. She pulled the sheets further up, shifting to lay on her side. As Lily thought about the day, she looked past their fantastic session and into everything that actually caused it. Vor is absolutely set on her being a liar, including On, but On appears to have a lot more logic to him or humanity. She didn't know what Vor was trying to prove. If she was plotting something, what next? Is there something going on that gives the Ek reason to be so suspicious? If that was the case, then why hasn't she asked questions about it? As she thought, her bedroom door creaked open. The hallway lights were off, so it was simply the bright moon lighting everything up. She swore it was locked. Bolting up, she shifted in her bed. It didn't take long for Lily to notice that the figure was Vor. How many times was she going to break into her room? The last time, the woman's deep feminine voice snarled. Lily covered her mouth had she said that out loud. The woman sprinted forward, pouncing onto the plump woman. She tied a cloth around her mouth, keeping her from screaming. Lily squirmed and flailed, muffled scream, as she attempted to escape Vor's grasp. She flipped her onto her back and tied her wrists together. Lily slammed her foot into the Ek's stomach, making her gasp for breath, but Lily was haggard from the lack of air from the cloth. She was also weaker than the werebear. Fucking bitch. The woman hissed quietly, hauling her onto her shoulders. Lily squirmed, kicking her feet wildly. Ho lao the Haji Pa, Vor whispered. Shut the fuck up. She walked up to the window sideways, opened it, and climbed out. They were on the second story, but that was such a problem for a werebear. She leapt out, the cold air hissing and clawing at Lily's skin. Lily only wore a large t-shirt that belonged to the man and a pair of his boxers. He had sweetly given them to her. I can't risk an invader. Not again, the Ek whispered as she snuck through the cold woods, not bothered by her winter apparel. There were far fewer werebears, but she still snuck around. It was clear she wasn't supposed to be doing this. The tribe is too important to me to take gambles. She'd continue on, no matter how much Lily flailed and screamed. If you're not the one hurting the children, then I'll use you to lure him away. hurting children. At some point during their travel, Lily lost all her energy. She limply laid on the woman's shoulder, legs dangling uselessly. Tears had begun to fall at the 5-minute mark of walking. She squeezed her eyes shut, sniffing under the cloth. It was so cold that it felt like her tears were freezing on her cheeks. Did Lily really deserve this? It was so cruel. She's never done anything bad to Vor. She hasn't insulted, yelled at, or called her name. She's just politely talked to her. But nothing has ever worked. It felt so unfair. Lily groaned loudly. Ho lao pa, Vor spat. Shut up. She muffled a few pleas, using whatever energy she had left to gain some sympathy, hopefully, but this time she was silent. She only had the sound of crunching snow and an eerie breeze to focus on. Beginning to think about what may happen, she whimpered. She could either freeze to death, die of starvation, or get mauled to death by a wild animal, though freezing seemed most likely and the second most painful. But what about the thing hurting the children? That seemed a lot more foreboding. With brand new energy, Lily squirmed and writhed on her shoulder. She flailed her legs until she continuously kicked Vor, who scoffed and growled. That's it. The woman hissed, throwing her onto the ground. This is your drop-off. Lily gasped, eyes widening as she screamed into the cloth. I only left your legs untied so you could piss off somewhere else. Vor turned, slowly walking away. Maupoahi, Lily. Hope your boyfriend won't miss you much. Good luck, Lily. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Lily watched as the Ek disappeared into the forest. It was freezing. The cold's fierce, gnarly talons gnashed and raked through her skin, freezing her flesh and leaving her to shiver and cry. In every direction she turned, the forest looked just as unending and eerie. Through her cold suffering, she forgot which direction Vor went and where they came from. Her feet were free from binds, but her wrists were tied, and her mouth was covered. Fortunately, her breath blowing into the cloth kept her face warm. Hovering her feet off the ground, trying to keep them as warm as possible, she'd try to decide on a course of action. Running in a random direction and hoping for the best was a bad idea. She definitely wouldn't make it in this cold. Lily thought of setting up a small fire. She'd need to make a small foundation, small sticks, and dry kindling. Wiggling her fingers, Lily pulled at the bindings. They tightened, but she pulled the knot closer. She tediously worked at it until she could pull one last time and they came undone. She wasn't dying here, not today. A twig snapped to her left. She whipped her head toward it, noticing a tall man standing nearby. Parking, she'd wave and muffle a small plea for help. His eyes, a murky monotone green, grew wicked. He'd throw his head back and laugh. How ironic. His gravely, deep, and uneven voice droned on, the lamb pleading for help from the wolf. Fuck. Her eyes widened, recognizing that this may be the man terrorizing the children. She truly did lure him out. His hair was a dark brown, but she noticed strange strands of platinum white hidden amongst his locks. He wore a black suit, large snow boots, and a long cloak to keep him warm. His clothing was weird. One of his hands trembled as it gripped onto a small, ornate box. Peeking under the lid were drops of blood, only making her wonder what could possibly be in the box. So pitiful and weak. He cooed dangerously, "Look at you. Oh, how the queen has fallen." Lily pushed herself away, the snow stinging into the bottom of her bare feet. "Now that you're immortal, you can die," he'd cackle, taking slow steps toward her. She muffled soft pleas, struggling to understand him. "You deserve to die painfully. I want you to ROTIN for what you did to my love." He snapped, talking quickly like a madman. The malicious man leapt forward, grabbing her forearms, which made her muffle a scream. Lily grabbed a sharp rock sitting next to her, stabbing it into his forearm. He yelped in pain, losing his grip on the woman. Lily valued her life too much. Clearly, he didn't expect a gentle woman like her to defend herself, so his stagger did her a favor. She pushed herself away and stumbled onto her feet. She tried to pull off the cloth as she ran, but it was tied too tight. She'd have to pull it off when she wasn't running for her life. Pute! The man yowled in a language she didn't understand. G Vise T Tour. She kept running and running, only thinking about getting away. The cold seared its teeth into the soles of her feet, and the cold breeze blew past her pale and exposed skin. Her oversized shirt and boxers weren't doing much for her. The Canadian pine trees passed by her repeatedly, all looking the same. It felt like a nightmare, running away but never getting far. She could only begin to plead, asking anything and anyone to help her. The cloaked man couldn't save her now. As if her pleas were answered, a tiny, uninhabited cabin showed up amongst the trees. As she got closer, her eyes sparkled at the sight of a bow and quiver leaning against the structure. She reached it in seconds, immediately stopping and shakily picking it up. Adrenaline ran through her blood. The cold was temporarily forgotten. The man in pursuit was far enough behind for her to arm herself. She can only hope this can save her life. Lily picked up the bow, shaking, pulling an arrow out of the quiver and leaning against the cabin. It was a makeshift longbow made from very loving hands. The wood was carved like a modern bow, but she could tell from its scrapes and small incisions that it was hand-carved. Raising the bow, she'd struggle to align the arrow. Fuck, if she can barely align it, then why even try to shoot? Her eyes widened as she began to recall a memory. Two large, warm hands gently held onto her shoulders from behind. A hot breath fanned against her ear like a large man hovering behind her. "Position yourself sideways," he whispered, gently using his own feet to align hers. "Stand straight," he kept himself pressed behind her. The arm holding the bow should be straight, doll. Lily straightened her arm. "Pull your arm up, aim your body, and bow at your target." The man pursuing her leapt out from the bushes. His arm coated in blood from the rock she stabbed him with. She aligned herself to face him, his eyes widening at the sight of her with a bow. "Breath in and..." His soothing, baritone voice hummed. "Shoot," Lily breathed out, letting go of the arrow. It flew like a bullet, stabbing into the man's collarbone. He yowled in agony, gasping and coughing as he staggered backward. His hand flew up to grasp at the arrow, but it was too deep in his flesh for him to yank it out. The warmth behind her had disappeared, but that didn't stop Lily from grabbing another arrow and positioning it on the bow. The man's eyes widened as she'd shot it, hitting him in the upper chest. He spat out blood, pressing himself against a tree. "Fuck," he swore. "What is this bullshit?" The man hissed. "Didn't think you could get so far with the body of a mortal." He narrowed his eyes at her, hate swarming in them like a swarm of bees. She would demand to know what he meant, but the cloth was still wrapped around her mouth. Lily pulled out another arrow, slightly stumbling as her body trembled from the Canadian cold. She dropped the arrow, pursing her lips and gritting her teeth in frustration. Now was not the time to stumble. Taking out another arrow from the quiver, she watched as the mysterious man started to run toward her. Still, she lets go of the arrow. It loudly slams into an oak tree sticking out of the wood. Her heart is rattling in her ribcage, panic swirling alongside the adrenaline. With every step, he was getting closer and closer. The fear of what he'd do to her only worsened her panic. A flash of white hit the man like a bullet train. He yowled in agony, his voice carrying for miles through the dark winter forest. A small, ornate box tumbled to the ground. The graying brunette's head hit the ground violently, and snow puffed up around his body. A massive white wolf stood above him, its delicate fur blending in with the winter freeze and gray eyes searing into the man below. Lily gaped at the wolf. Its beauty was unparalleled, with gentle fur and an elegant frame that no painter could fully capture. The man hurriedly grabbed and hid the ornate box in his clothes for safekeeping. She watched the massive wolf wrap its maws around his clothes and pick him up, galloping away with its newly obtained prize like a satisfied hunter. Grabbing the quiver from the ground and keeping her bow, she'd clamber around the cabin and jiggle the doorknob. Fortunately, it opened without much fuss. It was just as cold inside, but better than being barefoot in the snow. Closing the door, she set the weapons on a table and curtly found the bed. It was nicely made, the sheets were tucked in, and the pillow was fluffed. She'd have to make the bed before she left as an apology to the owner. Rubbing her arms to warm herself up, her feet had gone numb from the cold. She was scared for her life. Freezing to death was a horrible way to die, and she had too many mysteries in her life to die without solving. She especially wanted to live to see the cloaked man again. Was she in love with him? Maybe. He was an absolute sweetheart, protected her, and appeared to know something about her amnesia. She wasn't going to die without figuring out who she truly was. Absolutely not. Lily was incredibly fortunate that he came to her aid. She laid in his arms bridal style, head nestled into his chest. The man had wrapped her in his cloak, leaving his appearance exposed to her greedy eyes. The sun had slowly begun to peak above the mountains, coating the land with her warm gaze. Looking at the sun reminded her of someone, but it hurt her head to think more about it. She always preferred the moon. Mindlessly, her fingertips delicately traced his tattoos. Amongst the sharp turns and Nordic symbols, there was writing along his shoulder and forearm in a language she didn't understand. He hummed in contentment as she touched him. Seems that was an easy way to relax him. "Aren't you cold?" she asked delicately. She knew the answer because his body radiated heat like no tomorrow. Not one bit. He'd say, "How strange. Why?" She questioned, leaning her head near his collarbone. He tensed, avoiding her gaze before speaking. "I'm going to leave you near them." He told her, "I can't let them see my appearance." Lily furrowed her brows. That was the worst attempt at a diversion she's ever heard, or well, the worst she remembers. He'd slowly put her on the ground. Her feet were wrapped up with cloth they took from the cabin. She felt awful for stealing, but the man didn't care one bit. He only cared about keeping her warm. She kept her hand on his bicep, turning to look up at him. His extreme height was always a shock, but she began to find comfort in it. Pursing his lips, he appeared reluctant to walk away. She was just as hesitant. "I hope I learn your name soon." She smiled softly, watching him melt at the sight of it. "I think I'm falling in love with you." His breath caught in his throat. The man averted his gaze, bashfully unable to meet her gaze. Clearing his throat, the flustered man stepped away. "Stay safe." Lily giggled quietly as he trotted away, hiding the red invading his face. His vulnerability made her heart swoon and ache for him more. She holds the large cloak close, bundling herself up in it like a blanket. It was huge compared to her dragging on the ground due to her inferior height. The inside was fluffy, obviously made from a warm pelt. Walking through winter's tears was cold, but it was satisfyingly beautiful. She noticed the whitened landscape beautifully complemented the moon. The sun felt strange when it bounced off the shiny surface of the snow. Up ahead, she began to approach an archery. On wasn't too bothered about being awoken early this time. With slightly widened eyes, he watched Vor get chewed out like a piece of gum. Baldur roared at her, flailing his hands and constantly grabbing her to shake or hit her for her insolence. He constantly threw around the word sacrilege, which wasn't a term he used lightly. Vor had royally fucked up this time. Nearby tribe members anxiously stood on the sidelines. They held their bows, awaiting for the trio to move out of the way. Baldur had run up to Vor while she was walking back from the target with her arrows, and his verbal assault has continued there ever since Son approached not soon after, but he didn't speak a word. Fortunately, Baldur seemed solely focused on the Ek, for now. It was unlike him to be this angry since he tends to brush things off and not treat them very seriously. In other words, Baldur was very laid back. This was nearly as shocking as when On watched Ire get angry for the first time. "La Hayu, he." Baldur hissed, "I know you care about the cubs, but this is fucking a two." He flailed his hands. "Do you not trust me, Ek? I mean, really? Stupid." Suddenly, the Athel's gaze landed on. He tensed up. Baldur pointed at him. "Fu fofnde luta fau, did you know about this?" He had an idea of what Vor had done. "No, sir." He pursed his lips, trying to avoid his own personal screaming match. "Wow." He deadpanned, sounding like a disappointed parent. "Oh fu fau po hre you ona fu, Vor." He looked at the Ek. "You did this all by yourself, Vor." She was blankly staring at the ground. On couldn't tell if she was angry, ashamed, or miserable. Perhaps all of the above. "I asked you a fucking question." He hissed, getting up in her face. The Ek hurriedly nodded. "Ma." Yes, her title was on the line, but it wasn't like Vor didn't have some semblance of support. Other tribe members were equally suspicious of Lily, considering her timing of arrival and when the children started to Gethert. On agreed with her suspicions, but not with her violence. Baldur speaks to Uller, their god. He has nothing but respect for the two of them, so why would he defy their orders? On perked at the sound of snow crunching nearby. He looked around the archery before noticing a woman coming from the woods. The usually emotionless Fjordur raised his brows in shock. Lily had returned. Her arrival, especially in a cloak and small clothing pieces, confirmed his suspicions. Vor literally dumped her outside pack land. "Athel," he spoke up. The taller man whipped his gaze toward the Fjordur, searing his gaze deep into his soul. On gestured toward Lily. "She's back." Almost giving himself whiplash, Baldur immediately turned his head toward her. He bolted up to her, quickly bowing his head. "I'm so sorry." He apologized Laem Hijayahu for her insolence. "I'm so sorry." Looking at the Ek, she stared at Lily in absolute shock. Her eyebrows were raised high, eyes wide open, and lips slightly parted. She definitely didn't expect the guest to make her own way back. He was gone P. Da knees. Vor muttered Iga. She was gone for 5 hours. How? On leaned toward Vor, whispering quietly, "Ts fe eo re stau ing jayu ek." "There's no way you're staying as Ek." She threw him a harsh glare before they both flinched as Baldur roared. "Escort her to the healer." She lay in a warm bed at Laknari's hut, her cold feet sticking out at the end of it. Ire wrapped gauze around her feet. The soles of her feet had been disinfected and cleaned of dirt. It turned out that her feet had started bleeding by the time she got to the healer's hut. Fortunately, though, she won't be losing any limbs to frostbite. Lily had greatly improved her relationship with Ire. As their sessions continued, Ire finally realized she was telling the truth. As their relationship improved, she opened up about her growing relationship with the cloaked man. Like any sane person, Ire thought it was weird they were technically at third base, but she didn't know his name. Lily defended that man like he was her husband. Fortunately, Ire took the hint and told her some brand new information about him. He was closed off, but he always visited the archery to teach kids how to shoot a bow. Honestly, Lily swooned when she said that. There was nothing sweeter than a man who enjoys educating children on something he's passionate about. It's a good thing you warmed yourself up so soon. The woman broke Lily from her thoughts. "You should be able to walk out of here tomorrow." She fidgeted, averting her eyes. Lily hadn't told her the man helped her warm up. She thought Ire would assume he used uncommon methods. "Thank you." She laid her hands on her lap. Ire pulled the sheets over her feet. "No problem." She smiled, always happy to help. After giving her a cup of orange juice to enjoy, she left Lily to enjoy some alone time. In contrast to the usual cold hospital atmosphere, it was warm, like a winter cabin. A candle was lit on a table nearby, filling her room with the aroma of pine trees. It was soothing. Lily snuggled under the sheets, resting her head on her pillow. She still felt this impending doom. What if Vor ran in and kidnapped her again? What if Baldur decided she was right? As she swam in her scary thoughts, a fist rasped against her room door. Her heart sank to the bottom of her stomach. "Come in," she'd loudly say. Vor wouldn't be polite enough to knock, right? She was terrified of who was on the other side of that door. As the door creaked open, the familiar scent of a warm fire and winter cabin flooded the room. Heck came to visit her. He stepped in and closed the door behind him. A large cloak accompanied him, which was a dark brown this time. "Sorry." She'd smile bashfully, picking up the cloak she folded onto the nightstand and offering it to him. He approached her, absolutely towering over her while she lay on the bed. "It's no problem," he hummed. "I like seeing you wear my things." "Keep it." He pushed it back toward her. "You're sure?" Her eyebrows raised as he nodded with a smile. He beamed while looking down at her. His passionate stare made her slightly squirm, a deep chuckle following soon after. Feeling better, he leaned down, resting his hands on the mattress. His face was close to hers. "If you're still a little cold." "Well, I could always warm you up again." Lily's face lit up a bright red. He flashed her a toothy grin before planting a kiss on her forehead. He was definitely a lot more affectionate than usual. "I wanted to ask you something." She'd blurt, pushing past her flustered state. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to her, resting his chin in the palm of his hand. This burly, bearded man was as affectionate as a teddy bear. "MHM." He hummed. Lily sat up. "I know I asked this before, but I feel like you skated around the answer." This made him frown, furrowing his brows. "Why have you been so protective of me since the beginning?" She leaned toward the man. "Don't bring up my appearance as some excuse." He silently panicked, averting his gaze and leaning away from her. He looked around the room, desperate for an excuse to jump out, but there was nothing. "I'll tell you everything when you remember my name." Lily got fed up, clenching her fists. "Remember," she frowned. "Why can't you tell me it?" "You know me, you obviously do, but we want you just tell me." The man flexed his jaw, frustration and stress making his face scrunch up. "It's just," he pursed his lips and tried to come up with something to say. I can't tell you." Lily was getting more and more frustrated. She sat up more and leaned toward him. Imagine my frustration right now. She gestured to herself. If I were anyone remotely important to you, why wouldn't you tell me about myself? Her words seemed to hurt him, and he winced. Abruptly standing up and pushing the chair away, he wildly gestured to himself. It's irrational. He exclaimed, I know it is, but I'm fucking. He couldn't finish his sentence, either because he was too emotional or too reluctant to admit it, but he ran his fingers through his hair and gritted his jaw. Her brows raised. She bit her bottom lip anxiously. You're scared. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Clenching his fists, the man swung around and left the room in an emotional hurry. She was left completely speechless, confused by his fear but frustrated by the lack of answers. Despite everything, the man would leave the room with a quiet goodbye, politely closing the door behind him. The woman held her head. Nothing was making sense, and he kept skating around answering most questions. Looking at the bedside table, she noticed he had left something behind. Her eyes widened when she realized what it was: a bouquet of white lilies. Hurriedly, Lily rushed to save herself. Yanking some blankets off the bed, she set them on the floor and wrapped herself with them. While it would be good to make a small nest to warm up in, she knew a fire would be the thing to save her life. She was most literally freezing to death. There was barely any in the fireplace, but it would have to do. She got on her knees, which hissed from the cold of the wooden floors, and tried to use a lighter she found. Crossing her legs, she flicked the lighter on, but it refused to stay lit. Please. She whispered desperately, trembling from the cold. Come on. Her pleas were answered differently. Two hands rested on her shoulders from behind. It was similar to when she used that bow, but it felt so much more real. Muscular arms wrapped around her, lifting her onto a warm lap. A soothing baritone voice shushed her. I'm here, he whispered. Absolute relief washed through her. His veiny hand stole the lighter from her hands. He tried to light it but scoffed when it clearly didn't work. As she nestled further into his warmth, clasping her hands together and nuzzling her nose into his chest, he picked up a nearby flint rock. Ripping a piece of cloth off his cloak, he pulled out his knife and scraped it a few times on the fabric and rock in awe. Lily watched as the cloth lit aflame. He dropped it onto the small fire, waving at it a bit before it quickly got bigger. As the flame enlarged, she began to feel the warmth it emanated. There we are, he muttered. I'll get you warm in no time, doll. The man was like a living radiator. He rubbed her arms quickly, softly cooing words of encouragement. Was he trying to encourage her body to warm faster? That's adorable. You're shivering like a newborn fawn, he whispered. She nodded hastily, curling up as much as she could in his lap. Her hands were still absolutely freezing. His much larger, calloused hands took hers, raising them to his lips and pressing kisses all over them. You're far weaker than you should be, he muttered. You were never this susceptible to the cold. This susceptible. She was running through the woods in the dead of winter in nothing but a pair of boxers and a shirt. Who could sustain that? Then again, how did he know that? After that final comment, the couple stayed silent. The fire bustled and crackled, hissing as its flames chewed on the wood. The warmth from the fire and his body heat did wonders at warming her up, though he didn't seem to think so. This is taking too long, he huffed, clearly impatient. The cloaked man began to cover her in kisses. She giggled as he peppered her neck, shoulders, and face with loving kisses. Lily felt her cheeks go red, warming up quickly from his gentle assault. After his barrage of kisses, he leaned his head back and peered at her with satisfaction. There we go. He nodded. Now able to think properly, she thought about the fact he just showed up. Were you after Vor? Lily suddenly asked, still nestled close to him on his lap. He nearly went red with anger, of course. It was fucking Vor. He hissed through gritted teeth. He spat her name like it left a sour taste on his tongue. Oh, apparently he didn't know. I was tracking a wolf. He narrowed his eyes at her. She led me here. She smiled as he softly rubbed her cheek with the back of his hand. Not to hunt, he quickly emphasized. I have a soft spot for them. That was interesting. A formidable hunter who doesn't hunt wolves. She wondered why he liked them so much. Before she could question him, he leaned down and kissed her lips slowly. She leaned into it, fluttering her eyes shut and exchanging breaths with him. Pulling back with a gentle chew, he grinned. Thank you, Lily whispered. The cloaked man pressed his forehead against hers. No thanks needed. While her stay was brief, she still felt incredibly lonely. Zisa hadn't visited her once, and neither did Hydrun. The cloaked man was the only one who visited her. Baldur scolded and punished Vor for kidnapping her, but she still felt like things weren't completely fixed. On and Vor still didn't believe her. A strange man in the woods was after her, and she still didn't know who she was. The woman left the healer's building, donning a white sweater and warm bell-bottom pants. The cloak gifted to her rested on her shoulders, slightly dragging on the ground. Despite their argument, she missed him. It all felt like a big misunderstanding. Her hair was tied in a high ponytail, just enough to keep it from dragging. Her hair was beautiful, but it truly annoyed her sometimes. Treading down the 3 steps leading to the door of the building, she was forced to stop when 3 figures blocked her path. There she is. One of them pointed at her. 3 men stood in front of her, all incredibly tall and foreboding. It was easy to tell that they were hunters, a rank known throughout the tribe as similar to being a military soldier. They protected the land from harm. I think the Ek is right about you. Ever since you showed up, we've been having issues, one of them growled, Be Baldur Fegia High HLA Mu, and Baldur won't tell us anything. Lily frowned. I don't who re H nu H nong, oh, we're taking you. The 3 begin to approach her, and she decides it is a better idea to bolt. Lily ran as fast as she could. Her bandaged feet ached inside her boots, the crisp air blowing past her as she ran down the pathways. Tribe members watched her run past, some joining the chase after seeing the 3 men speed past them. It was clear many members shared similar views as Vor, even though their leader showed his clear distaste for the mistreatment. She felt like there weren't any tribe members she could trust. Lily could only trust the other guest whom she didn't even know the name of. Oh God, what kind of punishment is this? This was honestly bullshit. Loud yelling sounded behind her. They were clearly chasing her, and she couldn't outrun 3 large, muscular men. It was self-explanatory on why. Instead of running further, she notices a tiny cottage up ahead. It was the only building that hadn't been updated to modern standards. It was made of old wood that stood up firm against time, some dead vines attached to its sides. Lily did not discriminate. A hiding place is a hiding place. She flung the cottage door open, wobbling inside and slamming it shut. Lily leaned her back on the door as she panted hurriedly. Hiding was the best she could do until she could figure out how to protect herself. The entryway leads into a comfortable living room. Old pictures, some black and white and some paintings, depict earlier days of the tribe standing. Cultural ornaments were hung everywhere. Candles kept the room lit, and the scents of maple, pine, and cinnamon floated throughout the home. My FND, a deep, gravelly voice called out from further inside the home. Hello. Stepping out from the living room, a tall man stared at her with a raised brow. He had a beard and short gray hair, luckily devoid of balding. The elderly man had the muscle of a cosmic god. He set a mug of tea on his coffee table, still steaming. It was poured seconds ago. Her eyes were wide, eyebrows raised. Umla now, she stuttered. My bad, he sighed, scratching his beard. Lao Lu Fei, he hummed before gesturing, Boz you. It's no problem, come in. Lily was confused about his response. Was the home she picked the one with an important figure? I'm Hadyar Vis, the Gamal of the tribe. He pressed a hand against his chest. Barging into the Gamal's home is an offense, but since you're a guest, le ll fi gi lefnde. Elder's home. I'll let it slide. What great luck she had. She nodded with a small smile. He began studying her appearance, eyeing her from head to toe, making her uncomfortable. That's very kind of you, sir, but right now I'm being suddenly. It seemed the man noticed something. With a shocked expression, he quickly approached her. What's your name? He'd ask, clearly kinder than everyone else. She paused and furrowed her brows. Lily, she replied. Please don't tell her this old man would be another threat. He shook his head. Faye, your actual name. No, she glanced at the door, not knowing when or if the men would barge in. I'm sorry, but that's it. The woman frowned, hugging herself. Hadyar disagreed. No, that's not it. He was one step away from her, his towering frame blocking the hallway light. With his eyes looking down at her in concern, he clarified. I recall the goddess being named Selene, not Lily. The name Selene was frighteningly familiar. It was almost as if her soul finally opened its eyes, things becoming clearer. The objects she didn't recognize finally told her what they were. Not everything was immediately solved, but being told her name was Selene awakened. A lot. Selene. The amnesiac woman muttered, furrowing her brows in thought. Yes, that's my name. Hodyer looked incredibly confused as he watched her mutter to herself, but the woman looked up at him, conflicted. I'm not a goddess. He relaxed his shoulders, staring at her and studying her expression. This explains a lot. He lifted his hand and scratched his beard in thought. Yes, of course. Why didn't I figure this out? She furrowed her brows as Hudor motioned for her to come further into the home. Here, let me pour you a cup of tea. Selene looked over her shoulder as she followed him, the elder unaware of the men after her. They wouldn't break into the elder's home, right? She slowly sat down on a cushioned chair. Pelts were on each seat, and it was easy to tell they were real. He was quick to begin pouring a mug of tea. For a while, the Ongama was been quite futile. He explained, we've begun celebrating Mu Gu Ongama more often because HNO Fu Z2 Lu Jiu Ru Hiao NKU, successful hunts, they don't happen as much anymore. This was great and all, but she was biting her lip in nervous anticipation. She was literally hiding for her life right now. Uller hasn't been himself, he concluded, standing up with the mug of tea, and I think it started with you. Uller was the god of the hunt, but what did that have to do with her? Selene was beginning to feel stupid. Lao and Jao and Gao Lao the FNTA. Hodyer sighed, offering her a mug of tea. He lost his passion. Politely, she declined it by pushing it away. I'm afraid I don't understand, sir. From the look on his face that obviously worried him beyond an extent. I'd love to know more, but my life is currently at stake. The Gamal set the mug on the coffee table. Your life is at stake? His brows raised. She felt so overwhelmed, tears beginning to brim at the bowl of her eyes. You're not making sense, and those men chasing me should have been here by now, she'd rant. As if she had just ushered the final words to a ritual, the front door to the cabin was kicked in. The elder flinched, whipping his head toward the entryway. Hodiero Fuyu, he'd exclaim. The three men, accompanied by others, thundered in through the doorway with scowling expressions. What are you doing? Ig and Gago Da, a familiar, deep feminine voice roared. Elder, get back. Hodi Zu Uller's Tifu. Hodyer spat, curling his lip up angrily. Fu Zi Hai Zaha Go Da Tu FNDU, what in Uller's name? Don't tell me to back off. A few tribe members tensed at the man's exclamation, either bowing their heads respectfully or looking away. Lazi Njai Mi Pi Fao, the Gamal spat with venom, his claws sharpening and enlarging. I won't stand for this. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, the feminine voice showed herself to be Vor. The woman scoffed, Ho Lao Na, Ig Yuku. Shut it, old man. Hodyer was enraged by her disrespect. Selene was shocked, turn by turn, by her apparent disregard for people more powerful than her. She doesn't care about consequences. The elder breathed out and swore under his breath, clenching his fists. His eyes seethed with immense anger. Things were about to get a lot worse. Wait. Zisa had arrived, flailing her arms and getting in between Hodyer and Vor. Let's not start killing each other. She chuckled nervously. Selene sighed, happy to see a friendly face. Zisa, she breathed. What's going on? The golden-eyed woman looked at her with pity, averting her gaze and stepping into the crowd. Betrayal seeped into her heart, her expression falling into shock and horror. She really betrayed her. Hodyer was snarling, the only man between Selene and the crowd of angry tribesmen. This was her first time meeting the elder, but he defended her with his life. She brought that maniac here, he's been hurting the cubs. The Ek would hiss. The she-bears are protective enough, but it's gotten so bad that they've started hurting anyone who gets too close, if she brings up. Lily lured that weird fucking man onto tribe land. Does she understand the word victim? Hodyer scoffed. Her name is Selene Audu. The elderly man yelled. A few werebears in the group stepped away, nervous by the implications of that. Idiot! She stepped forward. I don't know who the weird man is. The terrified platinum-haired woman would say, he tried to kill me in the woods, then how the fuck did you get away? Vor would exclaim, cutting her off. Selene nearly felt ready to snap. Vor was being unreasonable at every turn, enough to piss off a gentle woman like her. That's an achievement. The Gamal was equally fed up. I demand you respect her, he spat. She is the Devu Adapau and deserves proper treatment? Hodyer exclaimed, gesturing to the trembling woman. She definitely wasn't a goddess, but she'd appreciate anything that helped at this point, the ex scoffed. On would appear amongst the werebears, pushing past to stand next to Zisa. The two knew how Baldur felt about the situation, and it was evident in their faces that they were conflicted. Selene held her head as her eyes got cloudy. Moon goddess, this tribe had some really bad hierarchy issues. Vor. On winced as the woman's glare settled on him. Iga lu times fula lo ha hio. He told her, Oh Haneha is a ta va. How many times do I have to tell you? Your rank is at stake. Vor gestured for the three men chasing her earlier to get Hadir out of the way. The three men approached the Gamal, but they were obviously reluctant. Hesitantly placing their hands on him, he shook them off and threw them a heavy glare. They grabbed the Gamal and pushed him out of the way, knocking over some mugs of tea. They smashed onto the floor, shattering while steaming liquids stained the floors. The loud crashing noises and fighting men didn't help with Selene's panic. Vor harshly grabbed the woman's arms, yanking her forward and hissing in her face. Selene began to flail and scream, and no. She howls, stop, stop, help. She kicked and punched, fighting for her life like a cornered rat. The ex-face scrunched up in a scowl as she had to avoid her punches. There wasn't anyone here on her side. The people she trusted turned against her, and she probably couldn't trust Hydrun or Ire anymore. Selene was left to her own devices. On grabbed Vor and ripped her arms off Selene. Stop it. He spat, Are you trying to get yourself killed? Vor clenched her fists and violently pushed On to the ground. I can't let more kids get hurt, she hissed. I can't risk my own cubs getting hurt. Her own cubs. As On stared up at her sympathetically, the Ek grabbed Selene again. I would never want cubs to get hurt. She screamed, continuing to flail as Vor began to drag her out of the living room. She wanted to yell for the cloaked man, but she didn't know his name. She couldn't scream for him to rescue her. Selene was left to her own devices. He was scared to tell her, but she had no idea why. Selene was desperate to know. She was searching for anything at this point, any connection or clue. Her name was Selene. While she didn't believe it, Hadir constantly exclaimed that she was the moon goddess. If Shuareth, moon goddess, then Uller is her husband. It was all she had. Uller, Selene desperately screamed, kicking at Vor and briefly getting out of her grasp. She fell to the ground, her body aching from the fall, but she hurriedly began crawling further into the cottage. To her dismay, Vor threw herself onto her and wrestled her on the floor, though yelping in pain as Selene started to scratch and bite her like a rabid animal. Selene was desperate. Her fight or flight was in full spin. Uller, with tears in her eyes, the gasped when loud bangs, snaps, and horrid screams roared around her. The walls broke open like sheets of paper, and a demonic, enraged shriek made her ears ring. The walls crumpled like paper. A horrid creature with blackened limbs tore through the building. He was 11 feet tall, his blackened body having splotches of white on his belly, head, and neck. Deranged, whitened eyes seared into his opponent with rage. The creature was a biped version of an aklut. Large talons tore through furniture, splinters flying everywhere. Tribesmen leapt out of the way, breaking through windows to escape or cowering in corners. When the aklut opened its bony jaws, a horrid scream from what sounded like an enraged whale made the walls shake. Glass cupboards and windows imploded. Selene fell to the ground, unable to move as she'd shrink as small as possible in the middle of the hallway. Vor and On shifted into werebears. They fought off the beast adamantly, defending themselves from their fear and outright deaths. The female twin didn't take her chances. Instead, running out the open front door, Selene was covered in broken pieces of furniture, glass littering the ground around her figure. The tornado of fury whirled throughout the house, but the woman was impossibly safe from its carnage. How was that possible? 2 bears the size of trucks attacked the aklut simultaneously, but he fended them off with enraged ease. The aklut was skinny, almost appearing small beside his tremendous height, but he had the strength of an army. Above them, the home was beginning to creak and groan. Load-bearing walls were being knocked down, and the earthquake of violence wasn't helping. There was no way she was going to die like this. Selene scampered to her feet, her body still aching from Vor and On's previous assault. The woman ran out of the open wall of the home, nearly falling over as she avoided flying furniture. Selene noticed a clear pathway through the forest as soon as she got outside. Trees, bushes, and rocks were annihilated, cast aside as if they weighed nothing. That Aklet traveled here through a furious pathway, and nothing could have stopped him. Tribe members outside panicked. A few ran up, wanting to help, but were immediately intimidated by the raging beast. It screamed and howled horribly, making her shake from fear. More walls shattered as Vor and On were flung out. Selene was hit by On, tumbling down the hill. The bear flew further ahead. Her head hurt, ears ringing, and vision distorted. Selene felt dizzy and sick. The beast leapt out, panting and hissing. As it screamed, the elder ran out from the front door, flailing his arms. Uller, heat holler, Lao Lu Hu Pao, it's our god. The F-Jorther shifted into his human form, gaze foggy. He stumbled to his feet, knee Fuji low. He muttered, crawling toward Selene and eyeing her up and down. Letting Jafe and Na, sacrilege, I knew it. On brushed off wooden scraps and dirt from her skin, delicately trying to preen her. He fell on his back, panting hard to regain his breath. He was bruised and slightly bloody, gazing at the sky tiredly. Img Fap? The Aklet howled, fending off Vor, who had gotten back up and continued to fight. She hadn't heard or ignored Hadyor's words. Ah Dr Img Hngana. It raked its claws through the bear's fur, making the Ek howl in pain. The creature was screaming in tongues and clicks words that could barely be uttered with his strange vocal cords. The words were brutal and horrific sounding, reminding her of satanic chanting. She crawled up to On and checked his wounds. He would be okay, just slight scrapes and bruises, but his mental was what took the most damage. Looking away from the scene, she noticed Baldur bolting toward them in the distance. He was horrified by what he saw, but that expression quickly changed to determination. While running, his bones cracked and shifted rapidly. Within seconds, a bear larger than the rest was the one barreling toward them. He had to be bigger than a Ford truck. Baldur was the Athel for a reason. The screams of tribe members echoed as the massive bear and Aklet slammed into each other. They bit, clawed, and tore at each other feverishly. Hadyor continued to panic on the sidelines. Baldur flew in with his teeth, but the Aklet grabbed a barrel and smashed it on his head. The bear stumbled back. Selene wasn't stupid enough not to see the fact they were losing, no matter how big the bears were. Still dizzy and terrified, the woman began crawling toward the fighting bears. Vor had joined in, battling alongside her leader with utmost determination. On panted weakly, turning to watch Selene crawl. No, Yi, he breathed. Da zao enkao o zuba, he whispered. No, please, be gentle with your punishment. She didn't know what he meant by punishment. He wasn't the greatest person toward her, but at least he never physically assaulted her. Selene was going to risk being squished to death. The three battled, ripping into each other. No matter how much they hurt the Aklet, it only seemed to fuel its rage. She was still crawling, her body aching and whimpering at every movement. Selene was merely feet away from their wrestling, just enough for her to lock eyes with the empty sockets of the Aklet. Yenenenthink came howling out of the hollow depths of his maws. Baldur and Vor were carelessly cast aside. Her heart thundered, eyes widening as the 11-foot Aklet stampeded toward her. It picked her up like a sack of potatoes. She didn't have the energy to squirm or scream. Instead, she let the creature hold her like a burping baby. It sped into the woods, bears chasing and screaming, but it sped up impossibly fast. The cold winter air wisped past her chillingly. It left the trees be, clambering past and around them. The Aklet leapt over rocks, bushes, boulders, and ditches alike. There was nothing it couldn't get past. The further they got, the quieter the noises from the tribe got. The creature's skin was cold and slick, the texture feeling like softwood. No warmth radiated from its skinny form. Black claws felt as cold as icicles. Selene felt haunted by its fierce eyes, which, despite their void-like color, still held the ferocity of a sharp canine eye. She could only hope this wouldn't end with her being eaten alive. It reached a point where Selene became fully aware of her surroundings. The Aklet kept running to the point where she had all the time in the world to recover. The fear had begun to subside, replaced with boredom. Selene resorted to pounding her fists on the Aklet's back. She demanded it let her go or bring her back. He was being a real asshole right now. "Let me go," she yelled, continuing to hit its back with closed fists. It didn't flinch once, obviously unbothered. The Aklet wasn't running anymore, instead walking. The creature's legs were so long that it might as well be jogging from how far apart its steps were. Selene was having enough of it. "I'm cold," she muttered, lazily draping over the creature's shoulder. Out of everything, that was what made it stop. Leaning down, it wiped the snow off a large log and planted her on it. The acklet adjusted her until it decided she was comfortable. "Ah, Volkna," it whispered through sharp-toothed maws, "Anna ipgoka, aloijai." Of course, Selene was still entirely unable to understand this language. It was unlike any language she'd heard some words pronounced in clicks or grunts. Her hands flew up, palming either side of its head and yanking its head to her height. Selene wasn't afraid to admit that the orca-like head was scary. It was large and strangely dark compared to the white landscape of Canada. "You're Uller, aren't you?" she'd ask. The creature stayed still, narrowed black eyes staring into her skull quietly. "If you are, then..." The woman narrowed her eyes absent-mindedly, looking at the rows of teeth her grip tightened. "If you're Uller, that means I'm Selene," she'd say, "and that you're my husband." Her head pounded, swelling painfully as more and more revelations ran toward her like a wrecking ball. The 11-foot, skinny creature began to pant. She watched his chest rise and fall quickly. Even though it was hard to see his pupils, she felt its gaze burning holes into her head. Selene suddenly lost her grasp on his head. His form shrank into himself, warping and shifting as if a black hole was sucking it in. Within a few seconds, a new figure stood in his place. While much shorter, he still towered over the short and plump woman. A distinctly naked man. Oh my God," she stuttered, hands flying down to cover her eyes. His baritone, rumbling chuckle floated into her ears like a drug that spread through the air. "It was the cloaked man. Her husband has been with her this entire time. It was a hard night." Aside from the rough love she received from Uller and his doting aftercare, he's proven to be the worst sleeper in this country. He would squirm in his sleep, his arms so tight around her chubby frame that it nearly suffocated her, with his breathing so uneven it sounded like he was doing a 10-mile jog. She could hear his heart hammering in his ribcage. How many times did he wake up last night? 2, 3, maybe even 4 times. Selene especially didn't know how many times he woke up without whacking her up. Uller was riddled with never-ending nightmares that plagued his mind. He was a formidable god who invented the idea of hunting, but endless nightmares afflicted him. Every time she escaped his grasp, he would startle awake like an arrow shot him. Terrified panic would make his eyes widen, his pupils minuscule as if drowning in his ocean-like eyes. She watched a 7'2", 350-pound man shake like a puppy scared of lightning. Running her fingers through his hair did wonders at soothing him after he jerked awake. His eyes would always squeeze shut in bliss. He wasn't able to tell her, but Selene had an inkling what these nightmares were about. They were about her, weren't they? He was scared that he'd wake up and she would be gone again. What was it like being alone for 100 years? She couldn't imagine what it'd be like to lose your wife, knowing she's still out there, and searching for a century only to come up empty-handed. She wished she remembered what led up to that. Lying in bed, dawn was approaching. The warm sun's rays beamed through their bedroom window. Selene loved this bedroom. The massive bed, big enough for them to sprawl out in any position, had numerous animal pelts to keep them warm. The bedpost was made from hand, large logs crafted to make an intricate Nordic design in the tall headboard. The fluffy pillows were, again, made from alpaca fur. Half of the pillows were shorter rabbit pelt, leaving her hair a lot less tangled than the alpaca fur. It was comfortable and fluffy, and she was starting to think that there was so much of it because it was her favorite. Uller did say he made this house for them, right? Maybe alpaca fur was her favorite. Besides, it doesn't kill the alpaca it's shed off, similar to how you'd shed a sheep. It's a win-win. The large werebear's head rested on her chest, his nose nestled into her breasts. It was questionable whether or not he could breathe, but he seemed comfy. His massive body was practically on top of her. She wouldn't be able to get out from under him, and that wasn't a question, that was a fact. Selene was practically his personal tiny teddy bear. She wasn't against it either. He tapped his fingers along the mug, his gaze uneasy. "Luna is your other half," he explained. "Pow, I can't believe I have to explain this to you." God. A frown downturned her lips as she rubbed his bicep. "I'm sorry." She cast her eyes to the floor. "You don't have to tell me if you don't, it's not that." He interrupted. Uller shifted his entire body to face her. With their proximity, her face was practically shoved into his chest. His warmth and radiating scent, cedar and a warm campfire, rushed through her senses like a water-falling fog. Delicately putting his half-full mug on the counter, his hands rushed to palm her hips. "I met you with Luna," he told her. She's my girl." His eyes started blinking rapidly as he looked away. "Oh, Lula Hiha. You're my girls." She grabbed either side of his face, her eyebrows curving upward. "Oh, Uller." All of a sudden, his arms were circling her body and she was squished against him. His face nestled into the crevice of her neck, his hot breath fanning against her soft skin. "Lang jam he na fu," he whispered against her neck. "Lahad hago he lu hu regaziz ko the gavo ilu ryu ears." "I was so alone. I watched so many werebears die over the span of 100 years. His voice was breaking, the rumbly baritone barely able to mutter out his thoughts as his breathing became erratic. Making her gasp, Uller would drop to his knees with her still in his arms. She slid down onto his lap, slightly adjusting her legs to be comfortable, as she moved her arms around his torso to start rubbing circles against his muscular back. His heartbeat rattled in his chest, thundering against her eardrum. Every breath he took was quick and uneven. Although his shoulders were as large as a mountain, they trembled as they crumbled. His muscular arms dwarfed her more petite body, holding her in a powerful embrace. "Kadu dido you," he muttered. "Oh, and Jayuza. Where did you go? You left me." His shaky words struck her with a memory. "Do you think it's ironic that we fell in love?" she asked with a slight giggle. They were speaking in an ancient language, Old Elegiac if she remembered correctly. It's now a dead language, but remnants of it are ingrained in Liu Can. He was lying on his back on the grass. They had just finished planting hundreds of white lilies in a field, the field where they first laid eyes on each other. She was a little worried. Her hands gripped the thick brown fur of a massive grizzly bear. He had a large hump above his shoulders, claws bigger than her head, and a lowered head sniffing the forest floor. Selene quickly realized why she felt a connection to the werebears in bear form. All of them reminded her of one word: Bjorn. The form of a massive grizzly bear was his favorite aside from his human body. Uller and Selene had spent a few days by themselves in their shared home. Her bedroom once felt incomplete, like something was missing, and she figured out that Uller was the one missing. She never slept as well as she does. When he's cuddling her, his nightmares persisted, something that likely will continue for a long time before he's recovered from the trauma of being abandoned. She's taken the time and thought to not leave him alone for very long, consistently being either in the same room or in the next room over. Many things needed to heal, but only time could tend to those wounds. She knew his anxiety wasn't from a lack of trust, but from fear. Was Selene starting to baby him? Perhaps. But he hasn't complained. Now that a few days have passed, Uller wants to return to the tribe. He needed his worshippers to see his wife alive and well and pay their respects. The winter wind whipped past her. Her long alpaca fur coat danced in the breeze, layered with a giant black reindeer coat. It was Uller's coat, but she had the idea of wearing it so he could return it when he shifts into human form. Her white hair was in a messy Dutch braid with 3 lace braids tight against her scalp on both sides of her head. Uller nearly tripped over himself when he saw it. He's always been a fan of seeing her in complex braids. She lifted her scarf to cover the lower half of her face and the tip of her nose as the winter air whipped past them. Uller was leaping through the Canadian forest with the speed of a deer and the destruction of a buffalo. As they get closer to the tribe's heart, she notices patrols warily eyeing the passing grizzly with wary eyes and twitching ears. They were all in bear form, likely because traveling was easier, but they still showed wariness. Uller, she leaned over his hump to see his drooping head. The bear grunted above the roaring wind to let her know he was listening. "When was the last time you mingled with your worshippers?" she asked him, nearly yelling so he could hear her. There was a heavy silence. The heavy crunch in the snow from his paws was barely audible above the wind whizzing past her ears like passing bullets. He was on the 3rd floor in no time. His massive and muscular legs climbed the flights of stairs with ease. With a waving reindeer fur cloak serving as his shadow, he left the chattering crowd outside the tribe house. The Nord rested a scarred hand on his forehead, unable to run his fingers through his braided hair. His feet led him to his personalized guest room, one that he had for over 70 years. It's become his sanctuary from the rest of the world where he could hide and mope. It meant no one could see him struggle. There was suddenly heavy panting and sluggish steps stumbling up to him. Whipping around, Uller's eyes widened. Lumbering up to him was a slightly disheveled and miserably panting goddess. Her lips were parted as she breathed heavily, clutching the left side of her squishy torso. Devu Haidu, she gulped a breath before swallowing thickly. Oh, okay. She sucked in a breath, could have gone slower. Moon above his brows raised before he shook his head and swore under his breath. He needed to remove himself so quickly that he should have at least carried Selene up the stairs. I'm sorry, Aura. He stepped toward her and palmed the back of her thighs, hauling her into his arms. Treasure. She wrapped her warm and chubby arms around his neck. Pulu Aku Iu Tifu, she commented with a smile. That's a sweet pet name. He knew that's why he called her Selene, is his treasure to protect. Simply grunting in response, he brought her into the guest room. If he was going to hide away in his guest room, he might as well take his safe space with him. Uller could hear her rattling heart pounding in her ribcage. He knew she wasn't the type to exercise very much, although she enjoyed her nightly walks during summer and spring, so she didn't have much stamina. Maybe he'll help her with that, but he loved how chubby she was. It indeed was a dilemma. You okay? Selene cupped his cheeks and nuzzled her nose against his. His face was normally emotionless, so she never had any idea of what he was thinking about. Uller grunted and sat her on his bed. His hands slowly slid off her pudgy thighs, memorizing their warmth and pudginess, before taking his hands away. The Nord's fingertips twitched from the urge to touch her more. Letting Jadefa he blurted, knowing she was likely wondering what he did. I cursed her. Selene's eyes widened, her plump lips parting in shock. His eyes shifted down to stare at them with a darkened look. Her long white hair waved in the subtle winter breeze. The blizzard had calmed down significantly. Piles of snow covered the village, teenagers and young adults using hand-made metal shovels to clear pathways and steps. Despite the sun glowing in the sky and the lack of clouds, it was still freezing. Selene hid her hands in her sweater pockets. The rabbit cowl kept the rest of her relatively warm and exceptionally safe from the cold breeze. The warmest part of her body, though, was arguably her neck. Cuddled around her neck was a giant weasel. His nose was tucked in the darkness of her cowl, though his eyes gazed out from the inside. Yes, a little shapeshifter was wrapped around her neck. Uller had told Selene the curse would cause her to be unable to contact her bear for 3 moons. If Vor tries to turn into her bear form, she'll turn into a caribou doe instead. For the first time in her life, Vor was now prey. Selene, though, wanted to talk to Vor. She wanted to understand why she treated her the way she did. Of course, Uller wasn't stupid. He had no intention of leaving her to see Vor alone, but he knew his presence would likely make things more difficult. He came up with the cute idea of hiding in her clothes as a weasel. Don't be fooled. Weasels are apex predators who are fierce hunters in this snowy landscape. They raid mouse dens, hunt small birds and insects, and will even square up against rabbits. This tiny mammal was born for the hunt. Uller spent 10 minutes telling Selene all about weasels and how amazing of a hunter they were. It was only to prove that he wasn't shape-shifting into a tiny, fluffy, cute weasel that'll cuddle up in her cowl and nuzzle her neck. Totally not, right? As she walked down a shoveled path, her legs were still tense from their romp. He spent some time massaging her thighs, but his roughness meant only time could heal her muscles. Up ahead, she noticed a familiar male face with a basket of fruit and vegetables. He wore a cream tunic under his large wool cowl and cloak. A scarf covered his nose and mouth for warmth. The Esjotha pushed the snow away to pick holly berries from a thriving bush. Despite being half buried in snow, the bush thrived with the beaming snow and damp soil buried beneath. Hibernation, chef. With a gentle smile, she approached him, Fupo Phoner Ramau, Hydrun. She greeted. Warm morning. She couldn't describe how, but the phrase had slipped out naturally. The snug weasel around her neck slightly shifted to watch the chef with a fierce gaze. Despite Selene being well aware of him, it was obvious that Hydrun had no idea he was there. The weasel leapt from her cloak. Mid-air, his body shrunk into the size of a ball. It burst into all directions before he landed in the form of a wolverine. Uller likely didn't want to be recognizable by any possible passing tribesman. The wolverine was the size of a large dog. The hem of his fur was black, but his back was a darker orange mixed with a blonde ombre. His bushy tail lashed behind him. Selene kept walking, taking large steps in the snow that hadn't been shoveled away yet. "You are not going after that cub," Uller's voice spoke in her mind. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" She huffed, taking large gulps of air as she strained herself. The wolverine effortlessly followed her through the snow, gliding across the top like a seasoned ice skater. Of course she panted as she took giant steps. "Of course I do." Finally, Selene stumbled out of the tall snow and onto a shoveled pathway. She brushed her warm trousers off and wiggled her feet to remove snow from the nooks and crannies. Uller scoffed as he leapt onto the path and shook the snow off his pelt. "Selene," he roughly rumbled, "let the search parties find the cub." She stopped and swiftly turned to stare at the fluffy wolverine. "They can't find the cub." The platinum-haired woman brushed the cloak from her face. "What if it's been days? That poor thing must be so hungry." His ears pinned back as he lashed his tail, slightly ruffling his fur before standing on his two back paws. He towered above her fiercely. "The cub could be dead," he told her harshly, making her gasp in shock. "The winter landscape is brutal and unforgiving, and how do we not know that man didn't kill the cub?" She held a hand to her heart. "Don't say that," she exclaimed. Uller shook his head and wrinkled his nose. "You're kind, that's why I love you. But you can't let your emotions get the better of you." A frown downturned her lips. Her brows furrowed, gazing up at the wolverine upsettingly. "Uller." He shook his head. "I'm not budging, Selene." He told her before lowering himself to all four legs. "If you keep doing things like this, your kindness will be your downfall." Uller shuffled his paws and turned away. "You have to draw the line somewhere." The wolverine marched down the path, his tail waving behind him. Selene wrapped her arms around herself, shifting to watch the mustelid pad away. He paused, looking over his shoulder and making eye contact with her. His animal form only made the shapeshifter harder to read. The morning light was disappearing the further inside the cave she got. Pulling the sled behind her, the transition from snow to stone made it scrape against the cave floors. Selene winced at the sound before noticing a particular wolf had similar feelings. Suddenly stopping, the large white wolf turned and walked toward her, using its muzzle to nudge the sled. "Leave it behind." With a nod of understanding, Selene lifted her goggles to rest on her forehead and unwrapped the ropes from around her armpits. She pushed the sled behind two large rocks in hopes that no animals would try poking into her food stash. The food was for the cub, who was undoubtedly suffering from hunger. Lowering her scarf from her face, the platinum-haired woman dusted off her gloves and nodded at the wolf. The pale duo continued further into the cave. It reached a point where it was nearly impossible to see in the cave. Selene stumbled over a rock, almost falling over, but remained upright. She breathed a shaky sigh. Looking up, she couldn't help but notice a tall torch in the distance. It stood upright, with three large rocks keeping it in place. It was slightly tilted toward the right, its bright orange flame flickering and creating dancing shadows along the walls of the old cave. Its head was turning black from how long it had burned. Slowing down, the white wolf let Selene catch up. When it continued walking, though, the canine stayed firmly beside Selene. "There's something dangerous in there." Passing through a smaller passage in the cave, they happened upon a large room. Tall wooden torches were lined up along the walls of the round room of the cave. Stalagmites jetted from the ceiling and floors with red clothes wrapped around them. Hanging from a few stalagmites were ropes tied to small wooden discs. These discs slightly danced, wavering around in circles, but on both sides were the crude red drawings of a fleur-de-lis, while others had drawings of eyes with slit pupils. Against a wall was a large platform made from old wood. Half of it was rotting, and mushrooms were growing from its mushy structure. On top of this structure was something that nearly made her hurl. Bugs flew around the massive corpse of a decapitated wolf lying on its side. Its fur was white, though part of it had either fallen off during the decomposition process or was never there in the first place. Stemming from the decapitated head was the rotting corpse of a female human. Her body was twisted sideways, her back resting against the wooden platform with her head sideways facing the steps to the corpse. The child was huddled on the sled in the blankets and thick coats Selene had brought. With unwavering gratitude, the caribou had stomped on the reins and stared down the goddess with want. Vor wanted to pull the sled. Considering her hooves and sturdy body would be excellent for pulling heavy cargo, Selene had wrapped the ropes around the reindeer's front armpits and fastened them tight. They didn't have a proper carriage saddle, so what they had would have to work. The white wolf was walking behind them, guarding their rear. Its limp had since faded, now wrapped with bandages, and it helped that it was a considerably tough wolf. Striding alongside the sled, the kind woman smiled at the warm child. "What's your name?" She cooed. Glancing up at her with his innocent burgundy eyes, he hummed Rotho. "Blessing." She held a hand over her heart. "What a sweet name," she grinned widely. "It suits you well, Rotho." As they trudged through the snow, massive Canadian pine trees passing them by, she stopped when she heard the subtle movements of tiny paws from behind. The snow was disturbed from below, dense enough not to be picked up by the strong nose of the white wolf. In a flash, something was crawling up her trousers. Selene yelped and jumped, patting herself down as tiny claws used her as a miniature climbing pole. "What in the moon's name?" she gasped. Everyone stopped. The caribou whipped her head over her shoulder while the white wolf jogged up to Selene. A fluffy pelt rubbed against her skin as it reached her neck, circling it before latching its maw around her earlobe. She winced and swatted at the creature. Peeling it off her, she held it out with both hands. Flailing and growling between her hands was Anna, full of familiar weasel with bright cerulean eyes and a temper that could best Thor. Selene sighed and held the weasel close, tightly hugging his tiny body. "Oh, I'm so happy to see you," she breathed with relief. "You were right. I shouldn't have gone out to find that cub. I should have used my head." The weasel huffed against her chest and squirmed, clawing at her pelt and climbing onto her shoulder. Sniffing curiously, the large white wolf recognized the mustela as not being a threat. He huffed at her. "You have no idea what trouble you're in." His heavy baritone voice echoed through her mind. "Half the time, I couldn't even find you because of my own blizzard. You're lucky I turned into a hawk." Selene scratched behind his ears, forcing him to lean into her touch and squint in bliss. "I had a feeling you were the golden hawk," she told him. "Why didn't you come with me in the first place?" She's been restless. For 2 nights, Selene has been plagued with night terrors. Both she and her husband would writhe with their different nightmares. They were haunted in their most vulnerable states, but she found her heart pounding harder than any nightmare had elicited. The mangled corpse of the blood goddess plagued her mind. Its stench would teleport her to that moment of fear watching larvae and flies writhe in its grotesque cocoon. Selene couldn't understand what kind of link she had to Signy. The mere mention of the name made her mind desperate for memories locked behind walls, digging at concrete for something she was not meant to remember. Sometimes, pieces would fall from the cracks. "Goo-doo, big sister." Flinching violently, the taller young girl closed her leather book and lowered her head. Without looking back, she spoke through gritted teeth. "Hody, what?" Selene fidgeted with her tan dress. La bi nga unju ga zi," she told her, "hio fu zi o kali he." Her gentle eyes brightened optimistically, hoping that this would help her sister feel happier. "I want to get you a wolf, so you don't feel left out." Signy went silent, her fingers gently rubbing the leather. Her mind seemed to swirl with different thoughts, and their position did not allow Selene the ability to try and decipher them. "Lango ni flew," she hummed before abruptly standing up. "I would love one." Writhing in her sleep, her eyebrows furrowing and lips twitching into a frown, Selene unconsciously edged closer to her husband's sleeping form and wrapped her arms around his muscular torso. Shifting, he rolled closer to her and possessively held her close. Despite being asleep, it made her feel safe. Signy was speaking in tongues, a language she had known from childhood as the language of witches. How could she have known that Signy was a witch? Glancing away, she stared at a terrified nude man consoling a woman against the trunk of a tree. He was in tears, his black hair disheveled, and his hands shakily rubbing her skin in search of any wounds. The young woman he was desperately checking had gentle blue eyes, a chubby frame and long, platinum white hair. She violently awoke from her dreams, gasping for air and desperately clinging to the massive body of her Nord husband. Her sudden movements and pounding heart awoke him with a start. His large arms encircled her protectively, holding her close and soothingly rubbing circles against her back. His fingers trailed up beneath her nightgown to trace his fingertips against her soft skin. Uller held Seleni's hand tightly. The two were bundled in winter clothing. Though Uller wore less than his tiny wife, her husband left Baldur to decide who would take X's new position while they were gone. Vor spent most of her time taking care of children, volunteering as a babysitter for busy parents, and beginning the long process of regaining the tribe's trust was completely different. He spent less time around tribe members as he recovered from public humiliation. Selene would have thought the tribe members would become hateful or scared of their god, but they seemed more faithful than ever. She heard constant chatting about how mighty and impressive he was for protecting his wife. She blushed when she heard the mention of it. Their view of Uller had greatly improved sometimes. It scares her how faithful one could be to one's god. They were going to Washington, America. It would mean they would have to pass the American border and hope for the best. She knew it was the last place she saw Signy and possibly some familiar people, but other than that, she remembered nothing. This amnesia is really getting on her nerves. With her oversized scarf, jacket, and backpack, the woman followed her husband with her hand clutching his warm one. Due to his superior height, his strides were long and quick, making Selene work harder to follow him. She was starting to breathe hard, and her legs ached. It was cold, too. This is why she doesn't like walking during the winter. Are you tired? Uller asked, slowing his strides to look back at her. She smiled kindly. No, I'm okay, the woman said softly. Suddenly, she was being raised into the air. Uller held her close like a baby koala, completely unbothered by the added weight. Selene knew his backpack was packed to the brim with supplies for their journey, so his strength was commendable. She gasped, but the surprise was gone. At this point, her husband had teased or picked her up so much that she'd gotten semi-used to it. At times, he'd carry her around like his favorite teddy bear. Pushing away the scarf, he nuzzled his nose against her bare neck, his beard scratching her skin. You're a bad liar, he'd say, voice muffled. Selene smiled and rested her chin on his shoulder. I try my best. With a hearty chuckle and a shake of his head, the massive Nord continued to carry his wife for the rest of the way to the border. Nothing could convince him to set her down. Hopefully, the border won't be an issue. They separated them. Separating people when questioning or gathering personal information was likely standard protocol, but Uller was against the idea. He thrashed, snarled, threatened. Selene knew his behavior was driven by his need to protect her, not his fear of being left alone. Uller likely felt that if he couldn't see her, she was gone. The officers were considerably concerned when the gargantuan Nord snapped his handcuffs. Selene's hands rested on the table. Her handcuffs were readjusted to be in front of her as they took fingerprint and face scans to recognize her on their systems. Of course, as goddess, she knew she wouldn't be on there. The woman fidgeted with the ring on her ring finger absent-mindedly. She was adamant about keeping it on mainly because she didn't trust them. She was only in her white knitted sweater and tan trousers. Her winter jacket and cloak were taken to be searched. They were likely stuffed in her backpack somewhere. Is that man related to you? The male officer who cuffed her asked. He seems protective. He had blonde hair shaven into a buzz cut without his helmet gear. His brows were bushy, and his eyes were dark olive. Her lips uplifted in a smile she couldn't fight off. He's my husband, she told him proudly. A man like him loathes being controlled. He uplifted a brow for a man who doesn't like being controlled. He is pretty damn easily manipulated by his wife. That isn't a very kind thing to say. Selene thought momentarily, gazing at the table and rubbing her hands against its smooth surface before giggling and quipping back. He listens to people he respects. Not registering the implications of what she said, the officer nodded and pulled out a notepad and pen. Now your name? Selene, she beamed. He slowly nodded. Your last name? There was a heavy silence between them. She didn't have a last name. Selene hummed in realization. She was so old, practically ancient, that she came from a time when last names weren't a thing. When a child was born, they were given a name, the only name they had. There were no last names or middle names. Why would you need to get so complicated? I don't have one, she told him. The blonde pursed his lips thoughtfully and tapped his blue pen on the table before sighing, "You're not lying to me." Selene shook her head. "No, sir." She smiled kindly. The border officers weren't prepared for their exit, not one bit. By the time they were prepared, she and Uller were miles into Washington. Finding them would be impossible, especially since a hunter knows how to cover his tracks. Now in human form, the Nord easily stepped down a small step and turned to aid his wife. This wasn't a small step for her, though. Selene looked down and noticed that it was a small cliff her size. Due to Uller's longer legs, he stepped down like it were man-made stairs. Roots jetted out from the exposed dirt and permafrost. Noticing he was offering a giant hand, she saw his metal wedding band carved with wrought iron affixed with reindeer antlers on the edges. Old Norse was written on the hard surface. Grasping it with her hand with her ring, she crouched and barely managed to stumble to the bottom. "It's like traveling with a dwarf," he teased, his thumb gently rubbing her hand before slowly pulling away. Brushing off her trousers, she looked up at him and put her hands on her hips. "Oh, really?" She leaned toward him. "Well, I might as well be traveling with a troll." Selene walked past him, taking her hands off her hips to brush away small sticks or bushes in her path. "A troll," he exclaimed as a dwarf. "At least I still gave you some dignity." He playfully scoffed and walked after her. "I am not a troll." Stopping in a small but comfortable clearing, she turned toward him. "But you're big like one." Washington's forests had little to no snow. Tall pine trees surrounded them, bushes flourishing under the shadows of the pine trees. The clearing had soft dirt with pebbles and branches scattered throughout. Halting and folding his arms, he raised a brow. "Am I just as dim-witted?" Selene tucked her arms behind her back and grinned mischievously, swaying her hips as she turned away. "Maybe." Uller's brows raised as he dropped his arms. "Maybe?" He parroted in shock, shaking his head as he growled, "Maybe take that back." "Nope." She flashed him a wide, teeth-baring grin. He scoffed. "If I'm so dim-witted, maybe you should be the one to set up camp instead." He challenged, "Considering I'll just mess it up." The platinum-haired woman's eyes widened and she whipped toward him. "No," she exclaimed. "Okay, I take it back." Uller exploded with laughter. "Oh, do you?" He snickered, "But I thought I was a troll." Grabbing his arm, she pouted, "Only big like one." He raised a brow questionably. She groaned and leaned against his chest. "Okay?" She drawled, "You're bigger, stronger, and handsomer than a troll." It was like the apocalypse started. Lumbering out of the brush, his paws were sopping wet with mud and dirt. The large creature towered over the brush at 7 feet, his large shadow looming over the green fauna. From head to toe, his black fur barely clung to his body. It was thin, with thinner patches showing on the skin below. His face was similar to a wolf, but gnarly scars exposed healed flesh, and his upper front gums were practically non-existent. Stumbling with his skinny body and exposed rubs creating bumps across his nude chest, it was as if he just crawled out of his grave and was in search of something to fill his bottomless stomach. A foul stench flowed off his body like a fog of plague. It was so sickening it made her eyes water. Uller jumped to his feet. Any semblance of lust from their mounting foreplay was pushed aside. Selene stumbled to her feet and mindfully avoided stepping into the fire pit. His blue eyes searched the creature who sightly swayed amongst the brush and watched them quietly. Despite the disgusting appearance, she recognized the scars and horrid smell. Argus. Selene muttered, but she opened and closed her mouth, but a proper sentence couldn't come out. Selene watched that man Getgard. "How is he here?" "You," Argus coughed. You can't escape." His voice was hoarse and breathy as if his vocal cords were damaged beyond repair. Her. Uller clenched his fists and scoffed. "I recognize a witch's magic from anywhere," he growled. "And I thought the Nords snuffed them out thousands of years ago." "What?" Selene gaped and whipped her head toward him. "Witches?" The Nord's knuckles and finger bones snapped as they shape-shifted into large, scaled talons with thick claws sharper than spears. He rolled his shoulders as his fingertips twitched in anticipation, slowly moving to stand before Selene. Wait, she looked around his gigantic figure and at Argus. "It's Signy, right?" She's cursed you." The lichen yowled and snapped his jaws at the duo. "I'm not Maudits." He screamed, I'm blessed." "Ma dis Emma Bainey." He hunched over as his hands twitched. "Bainey," Argus whispered. His insanity rolled off him like a tsunami, flooding the moods of others with his overwhelming devotion to his goddess. Selene understood that he was speaking French, which caused a sharp memory to jab her mind. Roughly in the 1600s, an influx of foreigners came to Selene's homeland. They spoke a strange language with thick accents that flowed like honey. They established a place they called Quebec. The trio was moving through the upper half of Washington. Bandages covered Luna's fluffy neck, her fur slightly tinted with her own dried blood. Older wounds from their last scuffle with Argus had since healed over, her fur covering them up completely. Despite how much they must have hurt, she was a tough cookie and tanked them all. Instead of following them from a few yards back, the wolf was now following closely at the rear. Uller firmly held Selene's hand, their fingers interlocked and wedding bands rubbing against each other. Since they had left Canada, the terrain had not been blanketed by snow, making the trails much more manageable. She furrowed her brows thoughtfully. Isn't Washington the capital for a big pack? Humming thoughtfully, Uller nodded. Yep, Tahi or something. I don't know. As they walked, Luna's nose scrunched up and she looked around warily. So, wouldn't there be patrols? She worriedly looked at her husband, and wouldn't the border officers have warned them? Uller shrugged. They're humans, whoever they alerted weren't the right people to alert. Just then, the snow crunched wildly around them. The bushes ruffled and danced before numerous wolves emerged from the cold shadows. Their eyes were sharp, searing glares into the travelers. Suspiciously they circled them, wolves ranging from black to pale brown. Studying their appearances, it was clear from their behavior that they deduced Uller was a threat. Selene's husband was 7'2", with 350 pounds of complete muscle. Comparatively, Selene was a chubby short stack. They seemed similarly concerned about the large white wolf, part of their small traveling trio. Uller snaps, lead me to your alphas. He'd snarl, we have important business with them. Selene fidgeted, noticing the wolves didn't look enthused about the idea. This is your goddess. Treat her with respect. Her husband added. Their suspicious expressions shifted into confusion and curiosity. The warriors were careful around them, especially considering they were likely enigmas to them somehow. This plan was worse in execution than it was on paper. She was finally given the opportunity to relax. The pale woman stood before a round outdoor table with a joyous smile. Birds cooed in the trees, crickets chirped amongst the grass, and the gentle breeze soothed the sun's harsh rays. Washington was much warmer than Canada. Tall pine and maple trees surrounded Selene's large backyard. Freshly cut green grass spanned a few yards before turning into a forest floor, with hundreds of ferns flourishing in the shade. Wild strawberry bushes were at the edge of the lawn and leaning toward the sunlight. The backyard was attached to a large rustic mansion with numerous floors. It blended into the temperate rainforest quite beautifully. She attempted to adjust to the higher humidity and temperature by wearing a white wrap dress with generous cleavage. Her long white hair was in a Dutch braid and lace tied against the sides of her head. Despite her husband's distaste for warmer temperatures, he seemed fond of her dress. Ever since their encounter with Argus, he's been awfully irritated. She tried to ask him what was bothering him, but he said it was a problem for another time. Selene stirred a large glass pitcher. Square ice cubes clinked together against the glass walls, floating on top of the amber liquid. She set up a large pitcher of iced tea for her husband to counteract the heat. Like a mom watching her kids play in the backyard, Uller showed Riot how to shoot a simple bow and arrow. They practiced with the bark of a tree. Riot was the woman who helped her and her husband get out of jail. Not only was this woman the Athel of Tahi, but she was also Selene's middle-aged niece. Despite her lack of knowledge of her blood relative, they've met a few times before. Alpha, a young man, made himself known with the subtle steps of his fancy dress shoes. Shifting to look, she smiled welcomingly at the middle-aged man. He was somewhat pale, though not as pale as Selene, and had amber hair combed back. His emerald eyes were striking, matching the beautiful rainforest around him. He was only wearing a white button-up tucked under his black dress pants, a Ferragamo belt keeping everything in place. The pale woman could see black tattoos littered with vibrant colors peeking from below the collar of his shirt against his neck. Leo Ku and Jew, he chuckled. The man's American accent rumbled like a diesel truck. "I feel honored to meet you." Selene giggled, taking the spoon from the bottle and setting it on an empty plate. The heat was beginning to irritate her. Rooting through her bag, she couldn't find anything to cover her without cooking. The couple was generously given a large spare bedroom in the mansion. The king-sized bed was tiny compared to their home bed, but Selene appreciated having a bed to sleep in nonetheless. The rustic bedroom was comfortable and familiar. It reminded her of home. Standing in front of the bed with her bag on the floor, Selene only wore pearl panties. Her breasts felt comfortable out of the bra, but the sweat building up under them wasn't exactly pleasant. Resting her hands on her hips, the pale woman puffed out her cheeks and thoughtfully tapped her foot. With a shifting gaze, she noticed Uller's giant bag sitting on a chair against the wall. Walking over, she peeked inside, stuffed a hand in, and pulled out a large tan tunic. It was the tunic he wore during the day, but it was exactly what she needed to survive the boiling night. Pulling it on, the shirt dwarfed her chubby frame. It nearly reached her knees, the V-neck exposing the valley in between her breasts. Without a bra, there wasn't much cleavage to look at. Taking her incredibly long hair, which had been dragging across the floor, she carefully started to section it into a fishtail braid. Padding to the large windows, which let in the gentle moonlight, she grabbed the sliding door handle and pulled it open. It slid open loudly, and the gentle breeze of the night welcomed her warm body with delight. The sliding door led to the outside. Since the bedroom was on the first floor, they had a small wooden patio with 2 steps to gentle grass below. Breathing a sigh of relief, Selene absent-mindedly stared at the moon as her delicate fingers were woven through her silk-like hair. As she gazed out the open sliding door, her gaze swept the forest edge curiously. But they stopped on a figure. Standing amongst the bushes was a tall and hunched-over figure. It might have been a trick of the light, considering she saw 2 stout ears and its lack of detail, but it made her uneasy nonetheless. Frowning and pausing, her eyebrows curved up with concern. Without warning, 2 massive hands gently took her unfinished braid from her grasp. Softly gasping, she let her fingers slip through the hair as it escaped her touch. She rested her hands in front of her, clasping them together as the breeze soothed the heat of her body. When her gaze returned to the woods, the figure was gone. A trick of the light, she supposed. Droplets plopped to the wooden floorboards behind her, sometimes falling to her exposed collarbone and neck. She struggles to sleep well, flitting between dreams and nightmares. Maybe she woke up because she knew something was wrong. Or Maybesh just got lucky. Selene's husband lay on the left side of the bed, sprawled out with his dark brown hair messily wrapped in a large man bun. He only wore his boxer briefs, the blanket covering his lower torso, and his tattoo and hair-covered chest were fully exposed. Wearing Uller's tunic, she scratched her thigh and shifted under the blanket. A gross smell was coming through the open sliding door. It stunk like a rotting carcass, and despite the subtle smell, it was sickening. Perhaps it was a skunk. Whatever it was, she wouldn't be able to sleep with the stench. Sliding out of bed, the moonlight gazing through the tall windows guided her to the open sliding door. They kept it open at night to circulate cold air through the room despite Uller not being too thrilled about it. But Lucifer's mansion was on a large property constantly patrolled by werewolves, so he wasn't as wary. She stopped at the light rumble from the far wall as she walked through the room. Turning, Selene couldn't help but smile at the sight of a large white wolf sprawled out on the wooden floor. Her back was pressed against the wall, her legs and nose twitching as she had her puppy dreams. Taking the sliding door handle, she turned her gaze to the porch lit by moonlight. It was foul. It was disgusting. It was revolting. A white-tailed doe was in the middle of the porch. Her face was frozen in horror, jaw agape, and eyes glassy. Lying on her side, her legs were spread, and her stomach looked as if it had exploded. Her intestines were ripped out of her stomach and trailed down the steps of the porch, ending up in the grass. Selene lightly gasped and covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes began to water from the overwhelming aroma of death and feces. With parts of the intestines ripped open, poop that hadn't been fully digested was leaking out. There was breathing. Her gaze was so frozen on the body that she took a minute to finally look up at the figure standing a few feet from the porch. Despite everything, Argus was hunched over in the grass. His stomach and chest, not covered in fur, were greenish pale and heavily bloated. Whenever a breath left him, It sounded like he was gargling on water. Feces was leaking out from him, his intestines likely waterlogged or blown out from being drowned. He was a literal corpse. The large Nord grits his jaw and scowls at the floor. Seleni's pale hands worked on his back, tightly pursing her lips and furrowing her brows while sitting close behind. Uller sat on the edge of the chaise, his muscular arms leaning on his thighs and back hunched over. The shapeshifter was shirtless, his strained muscles twitching every time he winced. Suddenly, he flinched and hissed lowly, "Selene." He warned. Quickly leaning back, her brows shot up and she frowned, "I'm sorry." She apologized, delicately continuing to sew the synthetic polymer fibers to close his back wounds. His thigh was already patched up. "I can only prevent so much pain." She pierced the skin and slipped another needle across the open wound before wrapping the thread around the tip of the needle holder. Pinching the end of the thread in the needle holder, she tied a knot and slid it down until the stitches were firm. "There," she sighed with relief. "I'm so sorry, Uller. I can't imagine how long it's been since you last got stitches." Closing his eyes briefly, the man sighed. "It's all right." He stared at the floor. "I'm mostly bothered by the fact Argus attacks aren't normal." Selene frowned thoughtfully and stared at the stitched wounds on his back. They weren't there for long, but he was already displaying signs of infection. They were more red around the edges and were beginning to swell beyond control. She had to give him extra stitches merely because of the sheer swelling. "A god getting hurt already isn't normal," she commented. Uller clenched his fists and slowly rose to his feet, wincing as his stitches kept his wounds closed. "Which is why we're burying him," he told her, "Cronus Riot, and I are going out to bury him in the woods. If he crawls out of that, at least it'll take longer." She stood up, her brows raising as she watched her husband take his shirt and walk around the couch toward the front door. "Wait!" She stumbled around the couch, her hand resting on the back. "But you're hurt." He stopped and turned toward her. "I know, Efenteba." Doll. Walking toward her, he awkwardly bent down to press a warm kiss against her forehead. "I need the satisfaction of burying his tea, Haji." He muttered, his beard scratching her soft skin. "Motherfucker." Smiling and shaking her head with a giggle, Selene relented. "No breaking your stitches," she ordered, gently poking his shoulder. Rolling his eyes playfully, he chuckled. The rare smile Selene loved lit up his face, his cerulean eyes gleaming with affection. Standing before her, tall and foreboding, was her supposed doctor. His eyes briefly widened behind his long curtain of hair. Muscles bulged under his white coat, smoothly tracing every crevice of his body, slightly wavering in the ventilation when she breathed out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her heart did jumping jacks at the sight of the man. Leaving her breathless and bothered, the doctor groaned, "Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me." A woman awakens chained to her own grave. She knows who she is and experiences brief memories of her past, but not of how she got here alone and to her own devices. She is introduced to a world different from what she remembers. Werewolves are known worldwide. A pandemic rages on, and she has no reason to be alive. All the woman can do is hope she isn't killed for simply smelling bad. Selene walked through the Washington woods, stepping over small logs and brushing past thousands of ferns. "Uller," she called out while pushing branches from a bush out of her path, "did you use witchcraft to curse Vor?" Her husband, who was ahead of her and pushing a large log out of the way to make a clearer path, scoffed with a shake of his head. Still wearing his tunic, his muscular arms were on show. He had a subtle limp on the leg with stitching, but it would have been unintelligible if she didn't know him so damn well. He was trying to hide it. "If I did, Jord would have amputated my limbs." He darkly chuckled. Due to his scowling face and deep tone, it was hard for acquaintances to decipher if he was joking or not. She remembered that Jord was the god that gave Uller his powers. She was the personification of nature, both cruel and beautiful in her own right. Considering witchcraft was not natural or intended, she had a bone to pick with Freja. River followed closely behind Selene, quietly listening to their conversation. Her mate would have come with her, but his job has become considerably demanding recently. Selene giggled. "Another mystery about your god-like power." She teased, padding past the moved log while avoiding critters scampering away. "Godlike?" He looked back at her. "I am a god, Efenteba." Doll. The pale goddess beamed mischievously. "Well, I'm sorry, Mr. God." River couldn't help but giggle at their banter as she brushed past a bush. "Is this how all your hikes go?" she asked. Ahead was a small cliff that led to the bed of a rocky river. The siblings explained that they had to cross the Skyhomish River to get to the old battlegrounds. As they stepped down a small cliff, Selene helped her niece step down by taking her hand. "You have no idea." The goddess smiled and leaned closer to River. "It's like traveling with a gorilla." She whispered. "I have the hearing of a wax moth and the vision of an eagle," her husband's deep voice said as he picked up a fallen tree and raised it in the air. Riot stepped down the slope behind them before gaping at the god's show of strength. She had lagged earlier, instinctively wanting to tail them from the rear to ensure their safety, but this was the closest she'd gotten to them during their hiking trip. "What makes you think I didn't hear that?" He stopped to raise a brow at his wife, lips angled down in a frown. His beard was slightly dirty from constantly clearing a pathway for them. This man never cared much for cleanliness. River shrank into herself, intimidated by his unreadable expression. Despite this, Selene grinned mischievously. "Foo fey, maybe your ears were too hairy." Dunno, he was turned into a monster. Stepping out from the brush was a taller, more rotted version of Argus. Half of his canine skull was exposed for the moonlight to illuminate. The zombie lacked his limp and pitiful stance and stood tall instead. He loomed over the brush around him, a wave of stink and green fog emanating from his disgusting body. It smelt like a rotting corpse that's been burnt and buried 1,000 times over. Maggots writhed between exposed bone and dug further into the decaying flesh. 2 white maggots fell from the top of his maw. His jaw was non-existent. When Selene gazed at him, she knew Argus was barely there anymore. What was left of Argus was trembling and yowling in the depths of his curse. The longer she looked at Argus, the more she remembered about her sister's wicked abilities. Argus was cursed to become a Eudeu, otherwise known as the incubator for a Eudeu, a creature birthed to be a slave for a witch. "You poor child," Selene held a hand to her heart. "Your wickedness led to this. Abomination." Uller ground his teeth and stepped forward, but Selene quickly put an arm out across his torso to stop him. They made eye contact. "Please, Eudeu are powerful." His brows raised and he gazed at Argus knowingly. "Eudeu," he whispered. It was no wonder Uller got hurt in his altercations with Argus during the incubation period. Now that he's fully transformed, there's no telling what he can do. He had the strength of a god with no pain or morals to stop him. Luna snarled and snapped her jaws at the creature. Growing agitated, it yowled like a monster from the depths of hell. Through its roars of rage, Selene could hear Argus' faint words behind them. "Ai de zm oi, si la fa et mael. Ai de zm oi, ai de zm oi." A witch easily fooled him with all the charisma in the world. Luna charged it and slammed her body into the Eudeu when it began to hurl forward. Or, what's left of Argus. Stumbling back, the creature grabbed Luna by the legs and slung her off his body. She yowled as she was thrown at a tree, hitting its wooden body. Leaves ruffled with the weakest slowly falling to the forest floor. Selene clenched her fists as she watched Luna get flung. She whipped her head at the Eudeu. "I did my best to be nice and understanding." She exploded. "I tried to soothe you, I tried to communicate, but you were too stubborn." It was cold, dark, and damp. With fluttering eyelashes and blurry vision, she held her forehead and settled into her new environment. Lying on the stone floor, dirty with rust and grime, a horrid stench of feces and urine made her cover her face and gag. She was lying on her side, her body pressed against the warm and furry body of a white canine. Sitting up with her nose plugged, Selene noticed the stench coming from the far corner of their room. A pile of feces and a bucket of urine a mix between them. Sometimes it was cleaned up, but it was mostly left there for weeks. It clogged her senses like a disease. Selene and Luna were in an underground dungeon in the far corner of a jail cell. No light except flickering torches lining the walls could let her see. They cast shadows as they hit the bars of the cell. No, her eyes began to water as she stumbled to her feet. Suddenly, she was hit with a wave of nausea and fatigue. The petite woman hit the floor, her palms against the stone, keeping her upright. When she looked down at herself, the old dress she wore was gigantic in comparison to her malnourished and skinny body. There was no fat to keep her warm as her body had eaten it to keep her somewhat functioning. Her white hair was abnormally long, left to grow out, but it wasn't tangled. Selene spent most of her time brushing it with her fingers, since she had nothing else to do with her free time. Gazing back, she saw that Luna was watching her while still lying down. The canine was mangy, with unhealthy and patchy fur and an unnaturally thin body. Not here. Selene choked out a sob and weakly crawled to the bars, grabbing them and gazing out at the hallway. No. Her body trembled sickly with emotion. And no, she whispered, La, Ngjangahi. She wept. I got out. The light was suddenly impeded when a shadow was cast over her from outside the cell. Gazing up, a sickly man with short gray hair and dull blue eyes warily approached. He wore a dirty black cloak that covered most of his body. He wasn't malnourished like Selene and Luna, but he appeared to be very sick. Her eyebrows shot up and she pushed herself away from the bars. Oh, a th defa. She whispered hoarsely. You have the curse. He was one of Signy's puppets. What was he going to do to her? Or was he a lackey sent to clean up after them? Ladu and Jehiu I yo and Ju, he said in a thick French accent as his eyes began to water. Let a fey ruri ngu. Fnda ha ngi jyothi. He began to fidget with something beneath his jacket. I never meant to betray you, I have no choice, but to serve her. She was finally awake. The pale goddess was lying on her side, head against a plush pillow and blankets pulled over her shoulder. She wore an oversized tunic smelling of uller and a pair of panties. Her long white hair was wrapped in a messy Dutch braid. Last she checked. She didn't change herself. Shifting in the bed, the woman turned her head to the other side. A large white canine was sprawled out, her paws and nose twitching as her mind galloped with pleasant dreams. The moon's light gazed through the tall windows, peeking over the shadows of Selene's body to lighten Luna. Slowly moving her legs to the edge, she sat on the mattress. The large blanket slinked off her body, letting the moon's light gaze upon her pale body. The tunic didn't do much in terms of covering her breasts, but it was comfortable to sleep in. Slipping out of the bed, she noticed her bedroom was the guest bedroom. The floors were squeaky clean, and she could smell the subtle lavender cleaning product. However, her husband's scent stood out. Rubbing the sleepiness out of her eyes with her fists, she blinked rapidly to adjust to the moon's bright light. A gentle night breeze swept through the room. The sliding glass door was agape, curtains pulled back, and the giant shadow of her husband stood on the patio. He only wore dark brown trousers, and his muscular back was devoid of injury or stitches. One hand was stuffed in his pocket and the other held something. From this angle, it was hard to tell. Memories were pouring into her mind left and right, leaving her heart aching painfully. Every day in that dungeon, Selene daydreamed about seeing her husband. She would curl up against Luna, dreaming of his protective embrace and salivating at the thoughts of his excellent dinners. She never wanted to be apart from him. Every day, she blamed herself for trusting Signy for even a second, because it led to so much pain. Her legs were shaky, her knees on the brink of collapse. Tears welled up in her eyes before breaking over the bowl of her eyelid like a shattering dam, wetting her cheeks and dripping from her jaw. With every step toward the patio, her heart ached more and more. Taking a step onto the wood floor outside made a brief creak in response to her weight. Uller raised his head and looked behind him, eyes alert. In his right hand was a bottle of aquavit. How did she know? It was his favorite from his time of mortality. Selene, his eyes widened at the sight of his downtrodden wife. Setting the glass on a small round table nearby, he hurriedly rushed to wrap his strong arms around her plush body. She nearly fell to the ground, losing all strength in her legs. Selene knew she could rely on him to keep her upright. Life was losing its meaning. He made sure the next generation was better than the last. Each child was thrilled to learn how to hunt under the god of the hunt's wing. They offered him feasts, gifted him their beautiful crafts, and invented nursery rhymes that were retold for years to come. But as time passed, the god of the hunt lost the thrill of life. He watched hundreds of people die over his entire lifetime, watching the hierarchy cycle through different leaders. The people he knew best suddenly became old and forgetful, while Uller stayed young and strong. Thousands of years ago, Uller belonged to a clan known as Eskjoldungs. They were famed across the land for their strength and sly battle tactics. They were unstoppable. They were a clan of shape-shifting Vikings. Uller could recount hundreds of stories of him and his brothers beheading vampires and witches. It was his people who brought those monsters to extinction. Some vampires and witches were too strong to kill, so they did the next best thing. They cast them away into artifacts. Now, Uller was the last shapeshifter standing. As time passed, they all died one by one. He often shook his fist at Odin, swearing him to hell and back. In recent years, Uller has distanced himself from his believers. All of his close human friends are too old to remember or dead, so no one knows why he did it. He was left alone in the wilderness, but their worship never came to an end. Treading through the woods, Uller loosely held his bow. It was inscribed with ancient Nordic texts, sacred texts meant to bring good luck to the hunter. When he first became the god of the hunt, tribesmen wrote text on his bow to bring him luck. He wore a bison pelt over his shoulders, a tunic made of dense pelts, and trousers wrapped with 2 leather belts. Usually, he would ensure his steps were silent and deadly, but his posture slumped and his eyes were heavy. He was hunting but didn't have the joy left to hunt. Suddenly, he perked at the sound of humming. It was delicate and tender, humming a beautiful lullaby that comforted his heart. While wandering through the forest, he stepped into a small clearing. Willow trees hung over it, casting small shadows and the sun beaming through the leaves. The soft grass was emerald, and small wildflowers littered it. In the middle of the clearing sat an ethereal being that made his head spin. It was like looking at nature's most beautiful flower like it had just sprouted, facing the sun and shimmering under its gentle gaze. How many times do they need to die? He was covered in blood and sweat beads of flowing blood falling over his heavily tattooed body. His muscles rippled as he moved, raising his arms and driving the edge of his war axe into the head of a witch of Freya. The massive man straddled her, his large thighs on either side of her hips. She wore revealing witch attire adorned with crow feathers and fabric that barely covered her breasts and groin. Her skin was covered in tattoos made with a knife. With nothing but a pair of slightly torn and dirty trousers, the sun beamed on his toned back. His skin was tan from countless years under the beam of the sun. Scattered across the small field were the remains of Yudeu. They were cursed patrons by the witch, forced to bend to her will. They were primarily wild animals, but he split one human in half. It hadn't rebirthed as a true Yudeu, so it was easy to cleave. If that witch were to listen to him, she wouldn't have cursed him. But here she was, chopped into 2 by his beloved ox. His hatred for witches was as intense as the sun's rays. He and his brothers slaughtered them one by one, ridding the land of their cursed practice and freeing the souls of their Yudeu. As the centuries passed, his people were dwindling. Soon, it would only be him, the last standing Viking. No matter how many witches he slew, his rage never dwindled. It would only lessen the day his axe split the head of Signy, the renowned witch infamous for her treachery, enslavement, and cult-like following. The population of witches grew each day by her hand. Rising from the corpse of the witch, he effortlessly pulled his axe out of her shattered skull. A few days ago, he noticed the obvious signs of a curse. His hair fell out, his throat grew dry, and medicine would turn ash in his palm. It wasn't his first time suffering the wrath of a witch, and it wouldn't be his last. Uller was good at solving curses. How did he do it? He slaughtered the witch and burned her home to the ground, watching the souls of those she's tortured fly into the afterlife to begin anew. Spitting on the corpse, he strolled away. Branches snapped under his heavy boots. Rustling the bushes, the large form of a white wolf trotted out from the depths. Her blood-soaked paws and maw dripped with the tears of her victims, her teeth stained to hell. Pausing, he reached a hand out to her. Luna approached, slowing her trot to a stop as her forehead matched his palm. Her fur was soft and delicate under his touch, betraying her ferocity in battle. A battle is not won without your maw sticky with blood, he told her. Well done, Luna. You are as trustworthy as the roll of the tide. He spent countless years on his Viking ships, torching the kingdoms of his enemies and hunting vampires and witches. He knew the sea like the back of his hand, his head drumming with its waves whenever he closed his eyes. It was a full moon tonight. Whenever the full moon arrives, Selene loves to sleep under the stars. Due to the cold seasons of the north, she isn't able to do it all the time, but it's a special occasion when she can. It was the first full moon of winter, and the pale woman longingly stared outside the window of her shared bedroom. She wore a white nightgown that barely reached her thighs, her pale skin glowing under the gentle light of her mentor. Northern pine trees were heavy with snow, their forms barely lit by the light from the sky. Without a surprise, two large arms snaked around her waist and hugged her. They pulled her into the embrace of a large man, her back firm against his chest. "You look sad," Uller whispered in her ear, the roughness a piece of his soul. She leaned her head back in his embrace. "Somewhat," she muttered, "like the others, I wish to sleep under the moon, yet I know the cold is unforgiving." He hummed thoughtfully, "We shall see to that." She should have known that when she had strife, the love of her life would not hesitate to mend it. He may struggle with his words and expressions, but his actions speak volumes about his love for her. She never doubted it for a second. And just like that, Selene was brought to a beautiful spot in the forest. Looking over the field of lilies, still thriving despite the snow, she could see the full gaze of the moon floating in the sky. Amidst her glow were delicate stars like snowflakes in the galaxy. Lying in the arms of Uller, she was kept warm under its glow. Luna was sprawled out over a blanket behind them. Despite the cold, her fur kept her insulated, and she found great joy sleeping outside during the winter. She had no intentions of cuddling if it meant overheating. "You bless me," Selene whispered, closing her eyes as she lay in his lap toward the lilies and moon. He rumbled with satisfaction. "You are my moon." The man leaned down and rumbled in her ear, tucking his face between her shoulders. Uller wore his reindeer cloak, trousers, and sweater dyed with red berries. His clothing protected him from the breeze, while his powerful shape-shifting body kept him warm. She could always trust him to lend her his warmth. Resting her hands in her lap, she watched his larger ones slowly encircle hers. His tan skin and scarred knuckles contrasted with her pale and petite hands. They swallowed hers up, his warm palms heating her body. In one of his palms, though, was a metallic object. As she parted her lips to question him, his hot breath against her neck made her gasp and lose her words. "My Effendi Ebba, hello everyone. In the future, I will be combing through this entire book and editing it. I will make plenty of edits, some less noticeable than others. These edits will include 1. Spelling mistakes, 2. Grammar mistakes, 3. Missing descriptors actions, 4. Realism mistakes. But alongside these edits, I will do bigger edits that I call for help from my readers for. These edits will include 1. Unrealistic scenes, sudden acts of prowess, inhuman actions. Did Selene just climb a mountain like an energetic Viking? 2. Out-of-character moments. Selene ignoring Argus' obvious stench and Uller waking up at the last moment. Yeah, nuh-uh. He's the literal god of the hunt. 3. Eye-rolling levels of coincidence. Selene protecting herself with a perfectly placed bow. Cool, just a little bit of well-placed theft. The examples I provide were discovered by all your comments. I would love to receive more so I can adjust parts of the story that don't fit. During this time, I am also taking recommendations about what you guys wanted or missed out on. This also includes bonus chapters. I love my bonus chapters. Not kinky enough sex. Need some more involved characters. Too short of chapters. Did the ending feel rushed? I'd love to hear all your thoughts. Ngo and Ju, thank you, Huldra Conunger.